Test, test. Test, test.
Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Test.
Test, test.
Test, 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 1, 2.
Thank you so much. Test, test.
Hello.
There we go. Thank you. Test, test. Thank you so much. Hello, hello. Awesome. Test, test. Test, test. Test, test.
Hello.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so you go up MacArthur, you go right on Greenville, go past that train track on the first right in that neighborhood.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, I gotta go really quick. Sorry.
Oh,
I was like, no, it's so hard. Test, test. Yeah. It's funny.
This one on the.
One that's usually here. Do you guys need this one on? We could turn this one off. Are you guys gonna have speakers? Test, test.
Madam Recording Secretary, please start the meeting.
Yes, Chair Vega, the meeting is being recorded.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the March 14, 2024 Santa Ana Police Oversight Commission regular meeting to order. The time is 5:09 p.m. This meeting is taking place with in-person attendance at City Hall in the council chamber. The public can also watch the meeting online via the Santa Ana YouTube channel or the city's website. Madam Recording Secretary, can you please conduct a roll call?
Thank you, Chair Vega. Commissioner Castillo-Latin. Noting for the record, Commissioner Castillo-Latin is absent. Commissioner Goransky,
Noted for the record, she is present.
Commissioner Mejia,
Present.
Commissioner Perea.
Here.
Commissioner Said,
Here, thank you.
Vice Chair Carpenter,
Here.
Chair Vega.
Here.
Records show 6 members present.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the Pledge of Allegiance. Where everybody could please stand. Right hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so now we move on to public comments. Now is the time for the commission to receive comments from the We're having some technical difficulties. If everybody could just stand by for a second. All right, sorry about that. We're having technical difficulties with
So,
Zoom, but we're still,
I apologize, just to confirm, it is streamed, it is accessible to the public in some manner online? Okay, yes. Apologies, Chair. We can definitely continue.
no worries, yeah. So we were having difficulties with the Zoom, but we're still live on YouTube. So moving on to public comments. Now is the time for the commission to receive comments from the public on agenda and non-agenda items. Pursuant to the Brown Act, the commission may not enter into discussion at this time. Speakers will have 3 minutes for their comments. Madam Recording Secretary, is there anyone that wishes to speak in person?
Chair Vega, we do not have any speakers for this meeting.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to the consent calendar. Item 1 is a regular meeting minutes of February 8, 2024, and the special meeting minutes of March 7, 2024. The recommended action is to approve the minutes. Would any commissioner like to make a motion to approve the minutes from those meetings? Motion it by Commissioner Gorinsky
I'll second.
and seconded by Vice Chair Carpenter. Madam Recording Secretary, can you please do roll call?
Motion to approve the minutes moved by Commissioner Goransky, seconded by Vice Chair Carpenter. Commissioner Castillo-Latin. Noted for the record, Commissioner Castillo-Latin is absent. Commissioner Goransky,
Here, please.
Commissioner Mejia,
Yes.
Commissioner Perea,
These are the meeting notes, correct?
yes.
Yes.
Commissioner Said,
Yes, thank you.
Vice Chair Carpenter,
Yes.
Chair Vega.
Yes.
6 ayes, 1 absent by Commissioner Castillo-Latin. Motion carries.
Great, thank you. So now we move on to the business calendar. Item 2 is training of Santa Ana Police Department, use of force policies and procedures. Santa Ana Police,
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to present to all of you. If you remember back to January when I last presented, my name is Brandon. I am the training sergeant at the City of Santa Ana within the training division, and I'm also the defensive tactics sergeant as well. What we're going to talk about today is all of the use of force policy and procedures which govern City of Santa Ana and how our officers are taught and implement use of force policies specific to any kind of use of force incident. At the same time, understanding that there's been legal changes in 2020 with Penal Code 835 and how those collectively govern how we handle all of our use of force incidences within Santa Ana. Specific to Penal Code 835, it's the understanding of the Santa Ana Police Department. There was significant changes made in 2020. Prior to 2020, the 835 was approximately 105 words. It was very, very basic, and it did not cover a whole lot. Since the law changes, there's approximately 900 words within that's codified in 835, and there's been significant changes. I tell our officers all the time, if you want to pound that square peg into the round hole and say that nothing's changed, that's fine. But what if you're wrong? At Santa Ana, we take it extremely seriously. If you were wrong 15, 20 years ago, it probably meant civil litigation. If you're wrong today, it probably means prison time. So it's something that we take to heart at the City of Santa Ana. When we talk about how we go about informing our officers, here's the course overview that we're going to cover with all of you. It's going to cover policy and procedures specific to use of force, and it'll have some of that 835 that we kind of just mentioned. It's going to talk about the legal considerations and statutes surrounding use of force. And then we're going to get into the control devices and techniques that we specifically use at the City of Santa Ana. That's going to encompass controlling force, the pain compliance techniques, personal body weapons, conducted energy devices, the 40 millimeter pepper spray, use of a police canine, baton and impact weapons, any kind of handcuffing and restraints, and then de-escalation tactics, which is required given that it's safe and feasible to do so. That's going to cover all of our less lethal aspect. We're also going to cover a portion of mental health, which again was codified with the changes to 835 in 2020, and it's been changed within policy 300 as well. And then we're going to cover, once we've gotten through all the less lethal aspects of it, we're also going to cover some deadly force aspects as well. I understand you guys went through 2 weeks of training with Mr. Touchstone. There's going to be some overlap, but in essence, this is going to be specific and governed by our use of force at the city of Santa Ana, what we teach and what our officers understand about our policy and procedures. So if we're going to start anywhere, we should probably have a definition of force. This is straight out of our use of force policy 300. The force is defined as the application of physical techniques or tactics, chemical agents, or weapons to another person. It is not a use of force when a person allows him or herself to be searched, escorted, handcuffed, or restrained. There is a couple scenarios that we threw on there just to kind of understand where we go or how we navigate investigating uses of force by our officers. So the first one, an individual is contacted, follows all verbal commands from the officer, and allows themselves to be handcuffed. Not a use of force, not anything that a supervisor would have to respond to the scene. Next one, another example that we have, a subject is contacted, follows all verbal commands, but upon contact by the officer, tenses or makes their muscles rigid to where the officer has to, in essence, make a little bit of an effort to get them into handcuffs. Could that be a use of force? Yes, it could be, depending on, there's 15 different criteria. There's a couple that could fall into the category of a use of force. If there's any kind of significant complaint of pain, if the individual alleges excessive force, if there's any kind of allegation that the individual is going to pursue civil litigation, that would necessitate our officer to contact a supervisor, and the supervisor would go out and commit a use of force investigation. All right, the final one that we have there is the subject is contacted, prones themselves out. Upon contact, begins to struggle with an officer. Proning an individual out is, in essence, the individual lays down on the ground, places their hands out at their side. So in essence, they followed the verbal commands, but then upon contact by the officer, there's a struggle to get them into handcuffs. In that situation, that's going to be a use of force. What a use of force entails, again, like I mentioned, there's 15 criteria that if we meet one of those 15, it's automatically use of force. Our officers know that. Our supervisors know that. Yes, sir. Personal body weapons, punches, kicks, knee strikes, elbows, heel palm strikes, anything of that nature, sir. There's 15 different criteria that, when met, necessitate a use of force investigation. Our officers know that, and our supervisors know that as well. What that entails is a supervisor responds to the scene. They talk to the officer involved. They will speak to the suspect involved. Depending on Miranda, sometimes it can be a lengthy interview. Sometimes it's relatively short, just checking on their medical status and well-being. What else goes on? Body-worn cameras reviewed. The reports itself are reviewed. If there's independent witnesses, they're contacted. Their statement is obtained. If there's any kind of independent surveillance footage, in essence, not a body camera from any involved or witnessing officers, but a surveillance camera, those are also obtained. And the supervisor who conducted that investigation will then generate a report regarding that investigation and that use of force. Our policy, this is kind of our definition of use of force when it comes to less lethal methodology. Our policy is almost a combination of Penal Code 835 and Graham versus Connor. So in essence, I'll read it to you. Officers shall use only that amount of force that reasonably appears necessary, given the facts and totality of the circumstances known to or perceived by the officer at the time of the event to accomplish a legitimate law enforcement purpose. The reasonableness of force will be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene at the time of the incident. If you take that, again, that's a combination of Penal Code 835 and Graham versus Connor. If you look at just Penal Code 835, when it talks about less lethal use of force options, any peace officer who has reasonable cause to believe that the person to be arrested has committed a public offense may use objectively reasonable force to effect the arrest, to prevent escape, or to overcome resistance. If you noticed, placed in red are some similar terms. It's probably beneficial that we understand exactly what those terms mean. In essence, what does objectively reasonable mean? So if I give you a quick English lesson, or how I can make it palatable to our officers so that they understand exactly what that means, let's take the word objectively. What does objectively mean? The synonym of it would be subjective. Subjective, it would be based on thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Objective, the antonym, would then mean based on facts, not thoughts, feelings, and emotions, but facts. So we're talking fact-based. Reasonable, if I had to remove the word reasonable and give you another word that means relatively the same thing, I would commit to all of you, fair would probably be something that we're looking at as far as reasonable. So fair based on facts is what we look at when we talk about objective reasonable. If I'm going to give you a picture of what that encompasses, that's again, very easy to understand, that would be the picture. So an American football field goal. Why do I give you that picture? Because an objectively reasonable standard is a sliding scale. It doesn't necessarily have to be right down the middle of that field goal post. It can, in essence, worst case scenario, it can doink off of the left upright, hit the bottom field goal post, and then hit the right upright, and it goes in. Now, we always aim to go right down the middle of it and make it a very palatable use of force. But at the end of the day, use of force is a dynamic, rapidly tense situation that sometimes can take any number of turns depending on the circumstances at hand. Okay, but that's one of the ways that you kind of can look at objectively reasonable. Does it meet the mark? Does it go through that field goal post?
I have a question. So
sir.
does that also change depending on the officer? Let's suppose we have a suspect that needs to get handcuffed and he is 5'7", right? A woman who might be petite, 4 foot tall, and then you take a male officer who's 6'5", right? We couldn't say that they both, we couldn't have like one standard for them both, could we? Or for example, I think we would all say that it's excessive for the 6'5" to use his taser to take down a much smaller guy. But then maybe we would say it's reasonable for somebody who's smaller, a smaller officer, to use a taser because most likely they may be overpowered by that 5'7" person.
So great question. What it comes down to is there's a testing mechanism that we have in place, which is kind of what we're going to go over in essence. And one of the mechanisms for that test is the Graham versus Connor test. Now there's 4, some would say 5 main factors, and then there's 8 or so officer subject factors. Relative size and strength of the suspect and the officer is one of those factors that will be documented. Now, at the same time, could that potentially go towards the mental understanding or cognitive ability of our suspect? If you see somebody 6'6", 350 pounds as a police officer, and this individual is rather smaller in stature and they're still willing to fight that officer, sure. So that could be a subject factor one way or another, both on the fact of the officer and of the suspect or the arrestee involved. Okay. Another way that I frame it to our officers is your use of force may not exceed the immediacy and significance of the threat posed at the time of the force. I'm going to circle back around and come back to that, and I'll let that kind of marinate there for a second. One of the factors that we utilize to teach our officers is the PEP platform. I'll get into that in greater detail later in the slide, but just for I guess, introductory purposes, PEP stands for Platform, Efficiency, and Proficiency. Whenever we're involved in a use of force, much like Chair Vega just asked about, there's a balancing test that goes on. When a supervisor responds to the scene, they're determining factors specific when it's less lethal, when it's not a lethal force encounter. They're trying to determine, was the use of force objectively reasonable given the totality of the circumstances? All right. So each individual that we contact as police officers, we would be considered a government entity. An individual we contact in a public setting would be an individual with certain liberties protected and afforded to them by the Constitution of the state of California and the United States. So that's a balancing fact. How much force did we use? What was the crime that we were investigating? What were the factors, the totality of the circumstances during that contact that led to the use of force? So it's a balancing act. The more force we utilize, the more justification or articulation that's going to be required for the officer involved in that use of force. Okay. So I said I was going to get back to it and hopefully make it slightly more understandable. The Rivas Villegas v. Cordes Luna, it was a domestic violence situation. It was out of Northern California, if my memory serves me correctly. The individual was called out by the police officers. He had a knife in his hand, refused to follow any kind of directives. De-escalation attempts were ongoing. At some point in time, the officers determined the use of a less lethal shotgun munition, a beanbag shotgun, was going to be a force option that they utilized. They discharged it one time, striking him in the abdomen or left hip area. Individual did not drop the knife. Some more conversations went on between the officer and our suspect involved. He was shot additional time with that less lethal beanbag munition, at which point he put the knife, no longer holding it, into his pocket. He then followed all verbal commands, placed his hands in the air, proned himself out in front of the officers, and allowed them to arrest him. During the arrest of that individual, the arresting officer did as he was instructed at their police academy, much like we teach at our police academy. We place a knee across the upper shoulder blades of the individual to facilitate handcuffing from a prone position. As a mechanism of control, we utilize the ground in that capacity. Again, the individual still had the knife in his possession, not necessarily in his hands, but it was still available to him. Mr. Cordes Luna is sued, excessive force allegation. It went to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit looked at the court or the case, viewed all the facts and circumstances. They said that the two beanbag shot, less lethal munitions were in effect objectively reasonable given the totality of the circumstances. However, they said that the knee across the back was excessive force. It ended up going, because again, like I said, what was the immediacy and significance of the threat posed at the time of the use of force? See where we're going with this? It ended up going to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court looked at it, again, sided with the Ninth Circuit. You're right. The two less lethal munitions were objectively reasonable. They then overturned the Ninth Circuit and said 8 seconds of a knee across somebody's shoulder blades to facilitate handcuffing is not excessive force. So it's something to consider. And that's what I tell our officers all the time. At the end of the day, do you really want to take this all the way to the Supreme Court on a situation? I would not recommend it, which is why that's one of those other aspects that we kind of talk about, the immediacy and significance of the threat posed at the time of the use of force. So that balance test that we talked about, what exactly are we referring to? So it comes out of Graham versus Connor. I told you there's 4 major, and I would say one that's kind of thrown in there as a 5th potential major factor in Graham versus Connor. First is the severity of the crime. The second is the immediacy of the threat. Those are your primary 2 factors that individuals are going to look at, or the court in general is going to look at when they're trying to determine objectively reasonableness. What was the severity of the crime and what was the immediacy of the threat? Now, much like Graham versus Connor is a balancing act, so is the severity of the crime and the immediacy of the threat. In order for us to take action, we don't have to wait for an assault to occur. We can be preemptive in it, provided we can articulate why we did what we did. Okay. So what do I mean in that sense? If we have an individual break out of San Quentin, prior convictions for murder, and they make their way to Santa Ana, they make their way into this chambers, and they're standing naked at the back of the room. Now, what's the severity of the crime? I would say that the severity of the crime is relatively high, right? We have an individual who's committed murder, has been convicted of murder, and has broken out of a very secure facility. However, what's the immediacy of the threat? Standing naked at the back of the room, hands visible. What can we actually do? If they're following all verbal commands, there's no need for any kind of force. Now, could you change the facts that change the outcome? Absolutely. At the same time, I'll give you one opposite. Officers dispatched to a municipal code violation in the park after dark, camping on the sidewalk, whatever municipal code violation it is. What's the severity of that crime? Relatively low. Now, officer makes contact at the threshold of that tent and the individual pulls a firearm. What's the immediacy of the threat? Again, the severity of the crime initially minimal, but the severity of the crime heightened upon the immediacy of the threat when a firearm was pulled. So you see how those factors, they don't both have to be high for us to take some kind of action in a preemptive manner. It's just a sliding scale, a balancing act, if you will. Okay, the last 2 are, is the suspect resisting? Are they fleeing? And then that final one is a split-second decision. I'll give you 2 options as to what a split-second decision could be. Individual calls in domestic violence on their partner. Officers, for whatever reason, have a extended time of arrival. So they arrive on scene. The last information they had was that the suspect had fled the scene and was no longer there. Officer makes contact at the door with their partner, and rather than the victim answering the door, it's the suspect, and they can see the victim in the background screaming, bloody, and crying. That's a split-second decision that they didn't really have time to plan ahead. Yeah, could they have done some research on who the individual was? Absolutely. But is that something they were anticipating? Probably not. I'll give you a different example of a split-second decision. We have an 8-hour standoff where our SWAT team's been on scene, negotiations have been ongoing, and for whatever reason, the SWAT team was called in. 8 hours has gone by. Could a split-second decision happen in the manner of that 8-hour standoff? Absolutely. But is that going to be viewed at the same way as the previous example? Probably not. Why? Because we probably know who the individual is, what their criminal history is. Have they been arrested before? When was the last time they were arrested? What are the facts and circumstances surrounding the SWAT call out? Are they supposed to be armed? Do they have any guns registered to them? Have we been there in the past? Are they on probation? Are they on parole? When was the last contact we had with them? There's a number of factors that we probably know going into it, because that's part of how we utilize our resources on a SWAT call out. Now, again, like I said, a split-second decision could happen during the course of that, but that's going to be viewed slightly differently than the first example I mentioned.
I have two questions.
Yes, ma'am.
So my first question is, how, as a police officer, do you deal with individuals who are neurodivergent? And what type of training have you all had to better understand that community?
What do you mean by neurodivergent?
So someone who has, who's on the spectrum of autism, for example.
We have a mental health component that we always speak to, specific when it comes to use of force and arrest and control techniques. When it comes to autism specifically, we've had several officers with family members who are autistic, who have given roll call trainings, signs and symptoms, who to contact, whose resources that you can utilize. Oftentimes when we come in contact with somebody who maybe the call went just fine and there was no issues this time, what we tend to do is put in notes or a call history of a log so that the next officer that responds is going to be aware of that the second they get dispatched to that location. Hey, be aware, Jim Jones is autistic, and his mother is somebody that you can refer to as a hook, not somebody like a trigger or something of that nature.
Yeah, and I wonder, and I know that there's different circumstances, right, where you might have more time to have this information, and there are times where that information may not be given, especially when some individuals can be high functioning but still be on the spectrum, right, where they might not be as responsive, but physically might look like they don't have any disabilities. And so I'm curious as to, in those situations, is the Santa Ana PD working towards addressing those type of policies and how to actually manage those situations?
Absolutely. It's always something that we're looking into. We have actually one of our senior office assistants who's assigned to training, who does that same exact thing for the other company that she works for. She works part-time for us, and she's in the process right now of potentially putting together a training that is specific to autism and individuals with autism. Now, again, depending on what we're responding to, we can only deal with what we know. Again, that's part of the definition of totality of circumstances, all the facts known to the officer and the suspect at the time of the altercation.
Yeah, and then that leads me to my other question. So I know that this is based on objective and subjective, right? And there's some things that could be objective to you and given in that information, but then realize that they were actually subjective based on your own personal information or biases. How does the situation, how is the situation handled? For example, when you mentioned, is there any accountability or any differentiation between when officers trigger a situation rather than the situation being? So for example, when you gave the example of someone being at the park late at night, they were not harming anyone. Sure, it was a violation code, but technically there was no threat to anyone else, right? They shouldn't have been there, but there's no threat. But an officer being in that position then escalated that into a threat for that person to be scared. One can look at it that way, right? So in that decision-making process, how much accountability is given into that actually, as an officer, I also created the situation, rather than had I not been here, this wouldn't have occurred.
I guess I'm kind of curious as to, are you talking about after a situation has occurred, after maybe a potential, are you asking like if a use of force occurs and maybe the commission looks into it and one of the takeaways from that use of force is the officer escalated the situation.
I'm thinking more as the decision-making process of the officer in that moment. So for example, the individual wasn't doing any harm to anyone at that moment, right? Then the individual you said shows that they have a weapon or they had like a knife or something. That escalates, but also, is there any thought process that had an officer not been there, that situation wouldn't have escalated, I guess is my question. Or does it not matter to the officer because the circumstances is that now there's a weapon they see?
So one of the things that we're going to cover when we come back around to PEP is that platform. So does it matter as to the call for service we're responding to? Absolutely. Are we not going to get more leeway from an armed robbery that just occurred where the individual was supposed to have possession of a firearm as compared to, like we just mentioned, a municipal code violation? Sure, we understand that. At the same time, who calls us? A lot of times at the Santa Ana Police Department, we have refused individuals that will not give their name, their phone number, anything. How much effort is going to be placed or put the officers in a position to potentially get into use of force, and all we have left to stand on is a municipal code violation? No, that's something at the forefront of every single one of our officers' understanding of use of force and just our contact with public at large.
I have a question that kind of following up with the member Mejia's. I understand where she's going with this, and it makes sense. Just by the fact that you're showing up can cause escalation because maybe the person has had bad experience with the police or has a bad perception of the police or whatever the condition is. So, you know, I know it's kind of a conundrum. I mean, but your sheer presence has escalated things. So what do you do?
And that's a question. Again, my hope in the embodiment of this commission is that there's a collaborative back and forth learning process between you as the representatives of the community and us as the representatives of the police department. If we can learn from one another, that's the hope. If that means that maybe we don't respond to situations like that because the juice isn't worth the squeeze, okay, then that's something that we can collaborate on and come to a consensus collectively, which I'm sure that the police department would be more than happy to work with you. And again, it's going to be dependent upon what the final consensus is, not only from the commission, but from the community as a whole. You know, typically when somebody calls the police, they're going to want something done. And if an officer doesn't respond, there could potentially be some recourse to their lack of response to a call for service. So that's always, again, there's numerous balancing acts that goes on in every single call for service, every single contact that we make.
I understand. Real quick question on SWAT. That would be your highest level of force, correct?
Well, SWAT is in essence a use of force.
Well, I mean, if SWAT is called, there's probably the high anticipation of a high level of use of force, correct?
SWAT is called because they have greater training experience with dealing with more tense situations than your run-of-the-mill patrol officer or your run-of-the-mill detective, depending on what that detective is assigned to. So in essence, they are more highly trained and ready to deal with tense situations that could go any number of ways, but it's also dependent on the circumstances because they don't respond to everything.
Mm-hmm.
Just because an individual has a gun doesn't mean we're going to call the SWAT team. There are certain criteria that have to be met for the SWAT team to be activated. Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly.
Oscar was already, again, good evening. As the assistant SWAT commander, I can tell you that, and having 20 plus years on the SWAT team, it actually on quite the opposite. Although by definition, the terms, because of special weapons and tactics, one would assume that there has the capabilities, the potential, but statistically, historically, you will show from specifically from our organization that it is quite the opposite. We will have a higher likelihood of a better resolution to it with less, if not no force utilized because of the specific training and the tools and resources that we have available. So although it may come across that way, I could assure you, and this is backed by statistics, by historical data, that and in essence, it's a lot more of a better form of de-escalating and have better outcome and resolution. So it's a great point, and I appreciate you bringing that up because it is unfortunately sometimes a misconsumed.
No, I appreciate your position. But again, I think the resolution is better because the greater use of force is potentially there. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
I mean,
Absolutely.
you guys show up full armor and automatic weapons and on and on, right? I mean, you're more likely to comply when you're up against a greater force, correct?
Well, that's what we'd hope.
Okay.
And sure, absolutely.
Okay.
But just also understand the fact that we have had respond is because it met a certain elements. We're not certainly not just going to respond to any call. It would have to have met per policy specific requirements as to why we would be there.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yes,
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
I want to thank you for really walking us through the use of force policy. You know, this was one of the concerns Commissioner Mejia and I have had with the previous presenter. And so thank you for also noting where things are also different here at the police department. I was waiting for this question when we had a presentation from the police department in relation to use of force and specifically looking at the different Graham factors. Specifically when it comes to the sense of the immediacy of the threat, when it comes to the split second decision and the suspect resisting, because all those things can be happening at the same time or be perceived by the officer to be happening at the same time. And I want to point to, and I believe, and the city attorney, please let us know if this is a conversation that can take place. But since this case was already settled, I believe we can talk about it. In 2014, June 19, 2014, there was a case of Santana police officer Booker, who was involved in the arrest of Edgar Vargas Arzate, a 27-year-old undocumented man. And this case, I remember this case, it was a very concerning case for a lot of us in the community, particularly because one, the events that took place, it was captured on video by a neighbor's camera. And then this young man was transferred over to ICE when he was on his way to testify in court. Officer Booker was later indicted in 2019 by a federal court for the excessive use of force. But what went down is what I want to ask about, and what will Santana Police Department will be different will do different given now what the new policies, the updated policies that we have. So in the video, Vargas Arzate is shown putting his hands up and then getting on his knees and then laying prone. Several officers are seen punching him and hitting him with a baton. Following the incident, Officer Booker was placed on desk duty and then retired in 2018. So the incident happened in 2014, remained on the city's payroll in 2018, and was indicted. He retired after 90 years with the department, moved to Texas, and then he was indicted by a federal court. According to the indictment, Booker falsely alleged that he punched Vargas in the back of the head 3 or 4 times because he believed Vargas was about to tackle him and possibly grab Booker's gun. The charges were brought against Booker following an FBI investigation. And obviously, Edgar Vargas was taken to the hospital and charged with attempting burglary and also potentially, putting the life of an officer in danger. But then it was later found that Officer Booker lied on his report. And so that was a very unfortunate incident that, many of us, it really started to create a strain between the community, not just because it was a young man that was where excessive use of force was used that led to very horrible incident, but also because of the immigration consequences that then took place for that. And so given that, and I'm reading, right, and we've been learning about where an officer might perceive a threat and how he will use a threat, but only the training can do so much, right? And if an officer perceives a threat and subjectively, no, objectively, subjectively acts on fear. And in this case, we had a very dishonest officer in terms of what he claimed. How does that, and I believe we have not had an incident like this since then. So I think that, that's really great. But I just wonder, how will the police department now train officers to respond differently to situation? Because that was an incident that really put the city on liability.
So in regards to Officer Booker's situation, I'd want to see, if you were going to ask my actual opinion on the case at hand, I'd want to see all the police reports, the video, and do an actual workup, not just render an opinion off of what I've been told. But as far as what's taught now, and you're talking about the difference between subjective and objective, pursuant to Graham versus Connor, much like we kind of mentioned, right? Objective based on facts, subjective thoughts, feelings, and emotions. What I always tell our officers is during the documentation portion of your report, you can throw subjective factors in, but it's always a recommendation to have several objective factors. Example would be if I pull the car over and there's two people in the car and there's only me, and I make contact with that car, would that be objective or subjective? Obviously, that'd be objective because there's two and one. At the same time, objective would also be, I haven't searched the driver, I haven't searched the passenger, I haven't searched the vehicle. There's a number of objective factors. So we're very specific as to what we document in our police reports, and specific to the changes to 835. It's imperative, and our officers understand the serious nature of those police reports, because when I was first brought up in law enforcement, we were taught you need to be vague and ambiguous and clarify on the stand when it comes to uses of force. I tell our officers now, if you want to be vague and ambiguous and clarify on the stand, that's great, but you're going to be the defendant, not the officer involved. And that's a point that we hammer home every single time. The last portion that we talked about in strategic communication, there was a portion that I put in regards specific to report writing. And I blacked out our officers' names, so it wasn't going to embarrass them, but I put two of our officers' reports up for the entire department to see as they came through training. Hey, what's missing in this report? And that's something that we specifically talk about, is the documentation aspect. If you're involved in a use of force, that's the time to sit down, take your time, and document absolutely everything.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, but I'll hold up until we go through the rest of the training.
Sure. Okay, so now we're moving on to our control devices and techniques. And this is simply just a slide about the force options that the city of Santa Ana utilizes as less lethal options for an officer to have as resources, okay? We'll cover all of these slide by slide, but in essence, we have pain compliance technique, which is documented in policy 300. Our controlling force, which is more of a understanding of body dynamics, jujitsu, wrestling, grappling, body positioning in situations like that, which would technically fall under policy 300, but I left it on its own. Personal body weapons, sometimes it's referred to as Vice Chair Carpenter pointed out, as PBWs, which we'll cover. And then we have less lethal options specific to the taser, the 40 millimeter OC pepper spray, and canines. And then we have impact weapons, both the baton and improvised devices. Yes, ma'am.
You're thinking about it. I heard a while ago that they've given up the batons. They won't let officers have them anymore. Is that correct?
No, ma'am.
Because you just mentioned it. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
it's still a force option
Okay.
that officers utilize. It's not utilized very often.
Mhm.
And what I did is, you'll notice at every slide where we talk about force options, I gave you the numerics for the past 5 years as to the force options and how many times they were used. So you'll see once we get to the baton, how often it's used, but no, it's still a force option available to officers.
Is that all of California or just Santa Ana?
No, that's specific to Santa Ana.
Just to Santa Ana.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Could have been another city that I had heard it somehow. Okay, thank you.
So we're talking about controlling.
Excuse
Oh,
me,
yes, sir.
Real quick question. I would assume that there's a use of force tree, for lack of a better term, within the city of Santa Ana. I mean, you just don't immediately jump to the taser. You would escalate your force based on the situation. Or do you have the option to go to your highest level if you feel it's necessary? And I don't mean to be vague on that. And I'm not going to give you a scenario because there's a million of them, but you understand what I'm saying. Things start to escalate. You have to escalate force. does the officer is trained to use X, Y, Z, or does he have the option to go to Z right off the bat?
So there is no use of force continuum is typically what that's referred to. There is no use of force continuum at Santa Ana. And to my knowledge, there's not a use of force continuum that any police department adheres to. That was back in the 80s, 70s, 80s. And the reason being is if you have a situation where you happen to drive by a in progress crime, maybe a shooting that's occurring, are you going to get out and try a taser before you utilize your handgun? No. Again, we could go down any number of different scenarios that utilize, but no, there is no mandatory use of force continuum. I don't have to hit every single option that we utilize. I mean, you can see all the options there. What's the likelihood I'm going to hit every single one of those before I get to a deadly force encounter? Probably not. Some things have gone drastically awry if I'm hitting every single one of those force options prior to the utilization of deadly force.
No, I understand. And again, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here. You roll up, the guy's being non-compliant, you whip out the taser and blast him. Is that acceptable?
So I'll get into tasers specifically as far as when the
You understand-
officers.
You understand my question. I mean, you know, the guy's not being good, you get out the baton and hit him.
So never say never, never say always. It's going to be dependent upon any number of different circumstances. Typically, no. Typically, there's going to be a back and forth. Again, whether it's 835 or whether it's within our own use of force policy, you shall utilize de-escalation options if safe and feasible to do so.
No, I understand. And that's kind of where I'm headed is, you know, it's just like it's an open question every time. And that's, I think, what makes it difficult for
Absolutely.
everyone. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. So specific to controlling force, again, like I mentioned, this is similar to grappling, wrestling, jiu-jitsu based body positioning and understanding body dynamics, how the body works, how you can manipulate the body using pressure and the ability to control somebody on the ground. Utilization of the ground is a control factor. That's what we're referring to in controlling force. Personal body weapons are not included for the statistics I provided, but takedowns are included. So if you notice, there's the little caveat at the bottom. The statistics pulled for this presentation were pulled on January 16th of 2024. The time period covered is January 1st of 2018 to December 31st of 2023. So in essence, that is a nice round 5-year number. And that's kind of what I went with, just to have a nice figure for everybody to understand going into it. So in those past 5 years, there's been 3,784 applications of controlling force, with 3,544 being effective, which is an effectiveness rate of approximately 94%. Yes, sir.
Can I ask, do we have an estimate of how many of those use of force situations have resulted in some type of lawsuit, allegation of police misconduct?
I don't have those numbers, and I'd hate to throw out any kind of guess without that kind of backing or any kind of legitimacy to my claims.
Thank you. If you could provide it to us at some point.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm assuming that submissions are not part of what an officer can use in terms of jiu-jitsu. You can't chokehold, armbar somebody, right? It's mostly to take somebody down and control them.
Yes. So obviously, I think everybody's aware, whether it's a chokehold or a karate control hold, that is outlawed. It's not a tool that the officers will utilize in the field unless it's a deadly force application. Now, as far as other submissions, arm bars, joint manipulations, yeah, those can be utilized, but just the officer understands that kind of goes from a controlling force situation to more what we're getting into now, which is a pain compliance technique, right? The point in that is yes, it's to control, but it's also the ability to provide a pain mechanism to gain compliance.
Is that how effectiveness is defined here? Like what you consider effective is exactly what you just mentioned right now?
The effectiveness is the ability for the officer, when applying whatever technique we're referring to get the individual into custody by the utilization of that specific technique.
Okay.
When that was just brought up by Chair Vega, when we're talking about pain compliance techniques, by definition, that is a technique utilized to gain compliance through the application of pain. So it's not necessarily, it can be a controlling force option, but specifically it's more the implementation of pain to gain compliance, which is why the numerics on this aren't nearly as high as our controlling force aspect of it. Okay, so when officers are going to utilize pain compliance techniques, oftentimes it's after a controlling force option has failed and a opportunity has presented itself to provide pain in order to get compliance. But there's certain things that officers need to be cognizant of during the application of that pain compliance. First and foremost, the degree in the application of the technique, which the level of resistance. Okay. The reason that's as important as it is because also changed at 2020 was Government Code 7286, where there's a subsection that talks about proportionality. Our use of force must be proportional to the level of resistance that we're dealing with. So that's an important factor, especially when you're going to deal with a pain compliance technique. Okay. The other factors that the officer is going to determine is whether the person can actually comply. If I have somebody's right arm and I'm utilizing a pain compliance hold while at the same time providing body pressure and they're laying on their left arm and I'm yelling at them to give me their left arm, what's their ability to comply? There isn't any, but that's something that the officers are taught and push through during scenario-based training to make sure that that's at the forefront of their understanding and their knowledge when they are applying those pain compliance techniques. And then whether the person has been given sufficient opportunity to comply. So same scenario, I can't have a pain compliance technique and the millisecond I say, give me your left hand and I don't get the left hand, I can't then provide more pain because I didn't get the compliance. I have to afford that individual the opportunity to comply with what I'm requesting them to do. Yes, sir.
A quick question for you. The pain compliance seems like it's kind of a little bit of a slippery slope because if I'm being arrested and I'm being subject to pain, I would say that it was excessive. Right? I mean, that to me, it seems like I understand the need for it. I fully appreciate that, but it just seems like that kind of opens you guys up for issues. I realize you're kind of between a rock and a hard place, right? Because again, if I'm being arrested and you're hurting me, I'm going to say you're hurting me.
And so Vice Chair Carpenter, if I have to arrest you and you're going to fight me, and the only option I have to get you into custody is to provide some kind of mechanism of pain to gain that compliance, depending on the facts and circumstances, the totality of the circumstances, I may have caused you pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that wasn't objectively reasonable to overcome the resistance you provided me. So yes, it can lead down a slippery slope, but at the our officers understand when they utilize certain techniques, there's a mechanism of control that you're looking for and effectiveness. The attempt is to get the individual into custody. And that's the goal when we utilize any number of different techniques. All of our less lethal techniques, the eventual goal is to place the individual into handcuffs. If that happens to cause pain because of the tense, rapidly evolving situation, provided it's objectively reasonable, that doesn't make it excessive. That doesn't at the same time prohibit you as the individual I arrested from making the allegation of excessive force.
I understand. I appreciate your answer. I realize it's kind of a difficult situation. Again, I guess it's one of those, it depends kind of things, but you know, my concern is that anyone can claim it was too much.
And at the end of the day,
and that's objective on your part and subjective on my part.
And chances are, if you ask me a question specific to something like that, I'm probably going to have to say, well, it depends.
No, I agree. I agree. I just, like I say, it's a little bit of a dichotomy of sort. So yeah, I don't know if there's a clear answer on that. Again, it's subjective and objective depending on who it is.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
Are officers trained to take into account physical limitations? For example, if somebody has an injured shoulder, I myself, I have 2 herniated discs in my lower back. There are certain things that if you were trying to handcuff me, my initial reaction is to jerk because of the immense pain that I'm in. You might take that as I'm resisting arrest, and then that could escalate.
It's a factor that's going to be, it's a factor that the officer is going to consider, but at the same time, it depends on the facts and circumstances. So if I go to contact you and you and I both know that you're going to jail. Hey, Mr. Vega, do me a favor, turn around for me. And you tell me as you're turning around, hey, sir, just a heads up, I've got a herniated disc in my lower back. Okay, that's absolutely something I'm going to take into, hey, would you prefer I use 2 handcuffs instead of 1? Right? That's where now, excuse me, if we happen to get into a physical altercation and during the course of that, where you're fighting with me, then you mention it, how much leeway am I going to give you? I don't know. Or how much leeway is the officer going to give you? I don't know.
Understandable. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. So
Yes, ma'am.
when earlier you had mentioned about objectively reasonable being similar to fairness, right? Reasonable being, is this fair? And then what I'm hearing is that your goal is to get the individual into custody, right? And so therefore the use of force is justified depending on the resistance and the totality of things. However, I wonder if you can provide an example where the crime is really minimal, but there's still resistance. Does that still justify the use of force?
It's going to be based on the totality of the circumstances. So if I have a minimal crime, right, the severity of the crime is relatively minimal, but during the course of that contact, an altercation occurs where the suspect is extremely combative. Does that not change the severity of the crime? Yes, it can, which would then mean that the officer can use a different level of force should they need it to overcome the resistance, prevent an escape effect and the rest. So it's
not really fair in terms of the level of the crime, but fair in the circumstances given.
well, the level of the crime, the severity of the crime is a factor that's part of that determining overall totality of the circumstances.
Let's say someone steals a pizza,
Okay.
petty crime. The person is 17 or 18, resisting arrest, and they don't want to comply because they don't want to go to jail and they're scared. What do you do?
I can't tell you 100% what I'm going to do every single time. It's going to depend on all sorts of factors, what time
Or
of
what
day.
would someone do in that situation, I guess? Like, does it justify the use of force if the person is resisting arrest?
It would depend on the level of force that's utilized and the level of resistance that the suspect is going to utilize against the officer.
Okay.
So
If I may as well, part of the big equation here when we're talking about using force and what techniques we're going to use, how much, when, all of that stuff. In the scenario that you painted right there, an officer isn't going to just right away jump on him and throw him into the ground necessarily, right? Because again, you painted a very generic, stole a piece of gum, and he just doesn't want to go to jail because he's scared. So our officers are trained to then communicate, hey, what's going on? Look, this is not a big deal. It's a ticket. You don't have an ID, you know, whatever the case may be. We train our officers to communicate with our community members to kind of explain the process behind it as well, to try to lower that anxiety. Just like, you know, the situation that Chair Vega brought up about having an injury. The key here is communication. The key here is don't get hijacked by your emotions. Our officers, we train them to try to remain cool, to try to remain calm, and to really try to utilize those verbal skills before they have to go physical. Because again, going physical for us is probably one of the last things we want to do because it causes liability, it causes injuries to us, and it just doesn't look good sometimes. And so for us, we really do try to rely on that communication piece early on to you know, the end goal here is compliance with the least amount of resistance and the least amount of physical force possible.
yes, sir.
And I really appreciate you answering our questions. I know these are very you know, we're just trying as the commission, we're just trying to really understand what's the bottom line when it comes to the use of use of force by the police department. I understand that sometimes you cannot provide us with, you know, what we would like to hear, like what would you do, because they're generic, and I understand the when you say that, you know, it depends. I'm wondering if what will help us as a commission is to really look in a previous case or a previous situation in which the police department in Santana was involved, and I'm not sure legal, you know, I'll lean into the assistant city attorney in this, but you know, the case that I just mentioned that took place 10 years ago. you know, if I will appreciate, I think that will help me understand what has changed, how things will be done better. If the police department could do a walkthrough to that case, look at the facts, look at what happened, look at the court documents, and come back to us with an analysis like this is what happened, and this is what we will do different now, or this is what the officer did wrong. And that way, I think real scenarios from what has happened in the city will really help maybe answer some of the questions that we have here. I'm not sure if it's possible to be done, but I put it out here for us.
Sure, and I'd like to just address that briefly. I think that's an excellent idea to the extent that some of these prior incidents are not subject to current litigation. There's no applicable privileges that may attach. I think that that's an excellent idea to potentially look at some past incidents, break them down, review them. The only thing I would ask, and I think this is what you're suggesting, Commissioner, is that it be said at a later hearing, number one, because it's not agendized here. But also to give our staff really time to prepare robust responses, create, potentially even create dovetailed scenarios where maybe something happened this way, but maybe it went this way, maybe it went another way, and how would the response be? But that would take some time to create. But I think what I'm hearing from Sergeant Sontag is that may be something that we could look into doing.
Absolutely. I serve at the pleasure of all of you. If that's something you want to do, I would be more than happy to do that with you and use it as almost like a practical application exercise, maybe a dry run of a future investigation that we may be sitting debriefing about. At the same time, the law was different back then, right? 835, reason to cause, believe an individual committed a public offense. You can overcome resistance, threat, escape, effect, and arrest, need not desist or retreat. That's it. That's all. That's all the 835 said. Again, we've now changed to almost 900 words. So it'd be even more interesting to now look back with the benefit of number one, 2020 hindsight, and number two, the application of today's law in yesterday's use of force. Absolutely, we can do that.
Totally agree. And yes, please take the time, and hopefully my fellow commissioners also agree with this idea. And I think that we will help from, I think we're having real life like scenarios and understanding kind of like what happened then and where we are now. Really hopefully helps address a lot of the questions that we have on these situations.
Anything else?
I just wanted to point out too, with regard to scenario-based training, remember, Deputy Chief has graciously extended the, why am I blanking on the name? The simulator at PD. And so that's also going to be some really fantastic scenario-based training, and those will get broken down at the end too. So just throwing it out there as a gentle reminder. Remember, all of you are welcome to attend, and I think maybe we can start looking into circulating some invites out there for different time slots where a quorum would not be at PD or would not be at the training at the same time. Do like a 3-3 and 3-3 and or 2-2 and 3 type scenario.
Is it fair to say that a lot of the litigations come not so much because of bad policy, but officers who went away from the policy? They broke the rules that Santa Ana PD taught them? I know that's kind of too general.
Yeah, it's extremely general. The civil aspect of why cases go to litigation as compared to legal is there's a different hurdle you have to overcome for a criminal allegation or a criminal charging as compared to civil. There's just a completely different set of rules that go into that. I mean, we can get sued for absolutely anything. And it's not always because the officer not always because they followed policy or they didn't follow policy. Again, everyone has their own truth. The officer is going to have their own truth. The individual who got arrested is going to have their own truth. Nobody's wrong. It's just a matter of where can we come together and figure out what's the best fair way to apply the law, both from our perspective as in law enforcement and the community's perspective. What do they expect from us as a police department? So just when there's any kind of application of a pain compliance technique, it's very obvious to say, but it must be discontinued once the overall, or the officer determines that compliance has been achieved. As you can see in the past, 5 years, we've had 33 applications of pain compliance techniques, 26 of which were effective. That's a 79%, effectiveness rate. When we go into,
Quick question, when you say effective, does that mean they got him in handcuffs?
yes, sir. So, much like,
Yeah, you see what I'm saying? You got 33 applications and 26 compliances. Would that be a fair act?
so the compliance or the effectiveness rate, much like, Commissioner Mejia asked,
Yeah.
is because of the utilization of that specific technique afforded the officer the ability to place the individual into handcuffs. Something that would not be considered effective is maybe I went for a pain compliance technique, and whether it was because it was slippery, whatever the case, I lose a hold of that pain compliance technique and I have to move to a different force option. That would not be an effective application of a pain compliance technique.
What about one that was proven to be a use of excessive force? You wouldn't add that to this percentage of being successful, correct?
So
It doesn't seem like it would.
no, it would not be. This is, again, these are simply raw statistics that the effectiveness is simply based off of the ability to handcuff the individual pursuant to the force option that's being described in the slide.
Real quick question. So if I'm understanding this correctly, handcuffs is the ultimate goal.
Yes, sir.
That's considered total compliance. Thank you.
I wouldn't say it's considered compliance, but that's the end goal.
But once they're in handcuffs, it's pretty much over.
Yes, and we'll cover that.
Generally speaking.
That's got its own slide that we'll cover as well.
No, I understand, but your goal is to get the person in handcuffs.
Yes, sir.
Thank
So now we're going to talk about personal body weapons. Policy dictated, it's a subsection of our use of force policy, which is policy 300. Personal body weapons, much like Vice Chair Carpenter mentioned, we're talking about any kind of punches or kicks or knees or elbows, palm heel strikes, anything of that nature. In the past 5 years, 1,089 applications, 845 were effective, and that's a 77% effectiveness rate. Next video, or we have a short little video that we're going to show you, and this is more of a demonstration to provide clarity as to the taser as a less lethal force option.
The Taser 7 is a conducted energy, less lethal weapon issued to officers and is carried on their duty belts. Once fired, the taser releases 2 bar probes intended to be attached to a person's skin or clothing. The probes are connected to the taser by a thin insulated wire. When activated and properly attached to a person's skin or clothing, the taser causes uncontrollable muscle contractions and reduces the ability to perform voluntary movements.
So our taser is governed by policy 304. Like it was mentioned in that video, its purpose is to incapacitate an individual by causing neuromuscular incapacitation. Which is an involuntary seizing of the muscles. That involuntary seizing of the muscles affords the officer the ability to then place the individual into handcuffs, preferably after 1 cycle, 5 seconds, the individual is placed into handcuffs. Once they're in handcuffs, the taser is then discontinued, no longer utilized, but we've got the overall goal of which we accomplished of getting the individual into handcuffs. Yes, Mr.
Quick
Carpenter.
question. You said 5 seconds, that's predetermined by the piece of equipment, or is that predetermined by a trigger pull?
Predetermined by the weapon, which is a 5-second every single trigger pull. Yes, sir.
Okay, so when you fire, it's automatic 5 seconds, but you can hit them again, another 5 seconds. You could hit them again, another 5 seconds. And how rapidly could you do that?
You can do it after every 5 seconds if you want.
You could hold the trigger.
You can hold the trigger if you want to do it manually, and it will continue until the trigger is released, Or you can do 5 seconds, it stops. If you still haven't accomplished the goal of handcuffing the individual, you can provide another 5-second burst.
But you could hold the trigger.
You could, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Now, in regards to documentation purposes, number one, that's going to be documented in the police officer's report. Number two, it's going to be documented in the supervisor's use of force investigation. And then number three, it's going to be documented through Taser and Axon. They have each cycle that's been utilized during a particular use of force event, and that's all part of the investigation.
Real quick follow-up question on that. Does the 50,000 volts decrease, or does it maintain that 50,000 volt cycle?
The way it's meant to do is maintain. So it goes 50,000 as soon as it's attached, and it stays that way until the 5 seconds is up.
Let's say you're holding the trigger. Will that continue to provide 50,000 volts?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you, honey. Go ahead, dear. I just back to this taser deal because you see it on TV all the time. So when they shoot it once, what does that do? Retract then and come back so you can use it again?
No, once it's been fired and the probes are fired downrange, they do not come back.
So what happens then with it? Do you have to automatically or manually rewind it or something?
No, we'll simply
Or
collect
is
it, detach it from the Taser system itself, and then collect it, and it'll be booked into evidence. Go ahead.
No, I don't have a quick question, just a minute.
They reload the cartridge.
That's what I'm gonna say, yeah.
Yeah,
They
there's,
reload it with the same thing or a brand new?
it's brand new. So
Okay,
each
all right.
cartridge comes with 4
I
probes.
see, I see.
Each trigger pull is 2 probes that extend out from the Taser system itself. With, if it's being fired at somebody, the goal being that it embeds in the individual's clothing or skin, delivers the charge, allows for the officer to make the arrest, and then that entire mechanism is detached and a new whole 4 probe system is then reinserted into the Taser.
Okay, all right.
So no, they're not, the probes are not reused.
I didn't think so because they don't do it on TV that way.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is there a statistic or number on the effectiveness of the taser in terms of actually disarming the suspect? So for example, when you use the taser, perhaps sometimes it doesn't hit the right body part, or the sweater is so thick that it's not penetrating. So is there a number that tells us when it's deployed, it's actually successful?
I have the overall numbers as far as the number of times it was utilized in the past 5 years and the number of times it was effective in assisting with the arrest of somebody. But as far as the disarming of an individual, we don't have those stats.
Okay. Follow-up question. I don't remember. It's okay. Thank you.
Problem.
One more question. 205 applications, 114 being effective, 56%. Is that 56% of them actually working to Commissioner's point, but it didn't hit you right, or the clothing was too thick, or on and on and on?
There's any number of reasons why the Taser isn't effective. Sometimes it is bulky clothing. Sometimes it's, yes, it comes with in essence, a laser targeting system where if I press, it's going to show me exactly where it's aiming. But on a moving target, that's not always where we necessarily hit. So there's any number of factors as to what makes it ineffective. But those are a couple that, yeah.
And
we've already
that's
mentioned.
included in these statistics, correct?
Yes,
So
sir.
some of them are just strictly didn't hit them.
Correct.
Thank you.
So the statistics you have is my goal was to utilize the Taser to effect an arrest. I used the Taser and it did not gain the ability for the officers to get the individual into handcuffs.
No, I think it's worth making the point that it might have been a malfunction, for lack of a better term. It didn't hit them right or whatever. It's not that it wasn't effective in its use.
It could be any number of things.
Former also Taser instructor. I personally been in the instructor course, I volunteered to be tased as one of the 3 of the instructor course. So just something to keep in mind. 3 different volunteers were asked in this particular course to come up. The first one, the instructor demonstrated how utilizing the taser on, say, the upper body from the waist level up in the back, both probes penetrating the upper body would temporarily incapacitate the upper body. In other words, it was locked that up. However, as demonstrated in the class, the student could still walk. So they're walking, but they could still walk. If they were on the floor, they got impacted by the upper body, but they could still kick. So essentially, an officer could interpret that as it was ineffective because there was still kicking, there was still movement. At the same token, the second student was asked to lay down on the ground, and the probes, the taser was utilized on his lower extremities, his legs. And although it was effective in penetrating the legs, he was told while the 5 seconds was occurring to swing and punch and punch. And that individual was experiencing the effects of the taser, but yet was able to still maneuver and swing the arms and avoid handcuffing. Even though the prongs were successful in penetrating the legs, they view that as ineffective. So the way ideally on the taser is what they call, you want to split the hemisphere, right? You want one probe to hit the lower portion of the waistline, the thigh, and the other one to hit the back. I happen to be the lucky one to be selected to be utilized in that example. So when I stood there and I took the hits from behind, one probe hit my lower back, the other one hit the back of one of my thighs, my right thigh. So when that happens, that pretty much just temporarily incapacitates you completely. There was absolutely nothing I can do other than just lock and fall to the ground. Now, of course, I was, escorted to the ground with 2 other students, but it was to demonstrate that even though all 3 were effective in terms of how they penetrated the body, how you could still see some of this movement. That's aside from the fact that if the probe did not, hit the clothing, aside from those issues, right? So when you see those, there could be a number of things. And what we're getting is the data from what the officer's documentation was. It was ineffective because we still had to utilize this other option, right? So just something to keep in mind with regards to taser, because that is something obviously we instruct our officers in. And it's not always the ideal case to get that perfect shot, right? Movement, the positioning the person's in, but having experienced that personally and knowing and felt those effects, I could tell you and seeing it that it was very clear that those things could still occur. So if that kind of helps you with that response, sir.
No, it does. And real quick, just another follow-up on that. Is the taser considered a pain compliance, or is it considered a different type of compliance?
Like we said, it's to temporarily
Immobilizer.
incapacitate, to
Okay.
allow the officers to then immediately go. And while even the 5 seconds, the duration,
Yeah.
they could go in hands-on and affect that arrest.
Although it is extremely painful, correct?
Although it's extreme, from personal experience.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I have a question for you. Go away. You got me confused here. Nothing new. You said you were hit in the back or the lower back and then the thigh.
Mhm.
Okay, how did that happen? Don't they come out simultaneously? Don't they come out together?
That's a great question. No, they don't. They're actually angled at about a 45-degree angle so that they were able to split at a
Oh.
further distance, the wider of the spread.
Okay,
So ideally, you do want to get a distance, right? So the closer we are, the closer the prongs will hit.
Mhm.
Well, they're close. Basically, the prongs, the electricity will go through in between the prongs. So if they're relatively close, believe it, it's not going to be as effective as if you have a wider spread.
Mhm.
So therefore, that's why from a distance you're able to hit them. Now the taser also has like a laser, right? So you could see where your dots will actually hit. Again, picture perfect world under control, a lot more controlled environment, but the officers are trained to work on that angle and aim at those, to be able to target those areas.
Mhm. Now what if it would hit the heart?
It's
Yeah.
not one of the intended areas. However, we recognize the fact that if it hits in those areas, we could go into the lethal portion, and so it's still considered a less lethal component. Now, it is something that you will see that, well, we're going through taser, there's certain areas where we want to avoid. And so in our policy, and the policy specifies to avoiding those specific areas.
I can see that. Because you think if they hit them in the heart, they give them a heart attack.
I'm sorry?
I said, you think that if they hit them in the heart, in the chest like that where the heart is, it would give them a heart attack.
I don't
Has
have a
anyone ever
statistic.
died from being tasered?
That
Tased, I guess, huh?
I don't have that information. I know.
So within the city of Santa Ana, no, not to my knowledge. Now, is there individuals that have died after being tased during a use of force somewhere in the country? Yes, absolutely. Now, is it directly attributed to the taser itself? That's not up for the police department. That's usually the coroner that makes that determination. And typically it's ruled a taser related or taser associated death, depending on the coroner's determination.
Thank you.
Sergeant Brandon, right?
Yes, sir.
Before we continue, let's go ahead and take a break.
Sure.
Let's recess for 10 minutes and we'll come back at 6:42. Madam Recording Secretary, let's begin.
Yes, Chair Vega.
All right, we are back from recess. The time is 6:44 PM and we're continuing with item 2, training with of Santa Ana Police Department use of force policies and procedures. Sergeant Brandon, please continue.
Sure. We left off talking about the effectiveness rate within the Santa Ana Police Department over the past 5 years by the utilization of the taser. 205 applications, 114 were effective, and that's a 56% ratage. Keep in mind the ability for us to use taser. Again, there is no use of force continuum, but there are certain tools that require a certain threshold that has to be met prior to the utilization of that specific tool. The taser is one of those options that we have, but the suspect or the individual we're trying to arrest must be violent or physically resisting, and that can be by words, actions, or deeds. They must show that intention to be violent or physically resist, and it reasonably appears that they have the present ability to do so, harm officers, harm themselves, or anybody else. We're going to move on to the 40 millimeter. It's governed by procedure 3004. And this is simply a alternative, less lethal force option. The taser has its downfalls in the sense that outside of a certain range, it's ineffective because the barbs and the probes only go a certain distance. The 40 millimeter can reach out a slightly farther distance, which affords more time and distance from the individual, gives our reactionary gap a little bit more of a mechanism to react to something that occurs. But the 40 millimeter is a shoulder fired, less lethal weapon, which uses a propellant cartridge to launch kinetic energy impact munitions. The projectiles are made from soft foam rubber, thus reducing the risk of penetration. The 40 millimeter launcher is a single shot weapon and it's accurate up to 120 feet. So we can reach out 120 feet to where it's effective. At the same time, there's a standoff distance, in essence, a proximity to somebody that is too close for us to be able to utilize this tool. So great on maybe a felony car stop, but if we're within the smaller confines of a small residential apartment, probably not the tool that we're going to utilize depending on the layout or what we know prior to going in. But there is that standoff distance that we have to apply by. In the past 5 years, we've had 47 applications and 23 of which have been effective, and that's a 49% effectiveness rate.
I have a
the-
quick question on that.
Yes, ma'am.
At what point, and obviously I know you collect data for your own documentation purposes and to determine whether it's working or not. At what is the threshold for the department to say, maybe this tool is not working for us? Like, is there any, or you just document the percentages?
So we absolutely look at that. And that's part of what we do in the realm of training is look at, is it still a force option that we want to use? I'll give you a perfect example. We used to utilize, prior to the utilization of the 40 millimeter, the beanbag round, which was fired from a shotgun. The problem was, or the reason that we got away from it, is there was enough evidence to support penetration with that beanbag round of an individual. These are supposed to be less lethal munitions. The last thing we want from our less lethal munitions is to potentially cause lethal harm. That's the reason that we transitioned away from that. And now we utilize the 40 millimeter because it has a much less tendency to penetrate. So yes, that's something that we constantly are looking at, which is why one of the jobs that I have within my duties is to review every single use of force at our police department.
Is every officer issued one of these? Or are they just issued the shotgun only, or do they issue this also?
So this is typically kept, each police car or black and white police car that's in the field is supposed to have a 40 millimeter in the trunk area accessible to the officer, but not necessarily where they're carrying it at all point or at all times.
And you said single shot, reload, fire again.
Correct.
Thank you.
Not sure if I missed this, but what is the graphic there?
So I was going to cover what the graphic is.
Oh.
The green is the locations that we're attempting to utilize as far as where the officer's aiming to fire when utilizing the 40 millimeter. And you can see the green areas are good to go. That's where our attempt at aiming is. The yellow is, we can still utilize it in those areas. Just be cognizant that it's starting to get into areas that are closer to the red zones and or the knee, where the knee is kind of a hinge point, which we don't necessarily want to affect to a degree if we can help it. And then the reds are obviously, unless it change the facts, change the outcome, unless the facts at hand change. And the only option we have is to utilize that 40 millimeter in a more lethal realm. That's when we would kind of target those red areas.
Does the 40 millimeter have the potential of being lethal?
It depends on where it's the proximity from which it's fired at and the target that it's aimed at. If it's a close proximity and it's fired at the head, absolutely can cause much more severe, potentially lethal damage.
Let's say we're excluding the head, because that's obviously not where you want to shoot somebody. The chest area at your normal distances, would that still be considered lethal?
It can be, yes.
It can be. Oh, interesting. Thank you.
And just so you're aware, every single one of our 40 millimeter launchers has a aim point sight, which is a laser sight point of aim, point of impact, depending on what the standoff range is. So those have not an iron sights, but a much more detailed sighting apparatus that's used just to avoid some of the target areas that we're referring to.
If at any time some of these forces turn deadly because, you're tasing somebody, they fall, they hit their head, they experience a heart attack, maybe they had a pacemaker or something, does it ever translate into now it was excessive use of force? Or as long as you were justified at the time to use that particular force, if something bad happens after that,
It depends. And what I mean by that is if I have a subject on a balcony saying that they're going to jump and I tase them and they fall off the balcony from a 4-story building, well, then yeah, that's going to be something that we should have considered prior to the utilization of that specific tool. But that's kind of one of those that's relatively obvious. Now, again, the tools that we utilize, it's a sliding scale as to the objective reasonableness of it. But depending on what the end result, as far as the coroner's final decision as to what caused that death, that's going to be kind of where we look at it when we're looking at those use of force specific tools that have been utilized.
What would be your minimum distance for the 40 millimeter?
You cannot be closer than 10 feet.
10 feet. And I understand your effective range is 120 feet, or is that your accuracy to 120 feet?
120 is typically where they say that you start losing effectiveness. In essence, you have to use much more Kentucky windage, which obviously mitigates your ability to be accurate. Hence the reason that they say it's not recommended outside of 120 feet.
So 120 is your max.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Our effective, correct? Your effective maximum is 120.
Correct.
Thank you.
We'll move on to pepper spray. Pepper spray is an oil-based spray with oleoresin capsicum as the active ingredient. When it comes in contact with mucous membranes, which is your eyes, nose, throat, lungs, those are affected. Eyes and nose, typically you're going to get a lot of snot from your nose, a lot of tears from your eyes. It is, in essence, it causes pain and discomfort, and the effects can last anywhere from 20 to 90 minutes. I can tell you, having gone through the police academy, being a fair-skinned individual, mine are much closer to 90 minutes than they are to 20 minutes, but be that as it may. The pepper spray can be used against individuals who are engaging in or about to engage in any kind of violent behavior to get them under control. In the past 5 years, we've had 45 applications and 32 of which were deemed effective. That's a 71% effectiveness rate.
Real quick, could we go back to the 40 millimeter real quick?
Sure.
When you're talking about the lethality of the weapon, again, obviously at 10 feet, that's probably going to be pretty lethal if hitting in the red zones.
Correct. It would
even out to the 120, would it still be lethal in the red zones?
Obviously, the farther away you are,
the velocity is going to decrease. I understand.
Correct.
But that's my question: is what is the lethal distances?
I would not be able to give you an accurate representation as far as if I hit you from 120 feet in the head, is that going to cause lethality? I don't know.
No, we're discounting headshots. I mean, you're not going to go for the head, but I'm 20 feet still. You see what I'm saying? Because I mean, at some point, this really becomes a lethal weapon at certain distances. I appreciate you're trying to hit somebody in the arm or the leg or the midsection. Things happen.
Correct. That's why we teach, if it's going to be utilized as a less lethal option, again, if we're in a lethal force encounter, this is not the tool to utilize, regardless of its ability to potentially be lethal, right? We're going to use the right tool for the right job. Lethal force is going to, or a lethal threat is going to require lethal force. The 40 millimeter notwithstanding.
No, I understand that, but I guess I'm not making myself clear. So from 10 feet to 20 feet, still lethal? From 20 feet to 50 feet, still lethal in the red zones?
At any point in time, if you're hitting red zones, that could potentially be lethal, regardless of how far away you are.
Okay.
Obviously, the closer you are, the closer proximity, the much more lethal
Higher velocity,
it could be.
more foot pounds,
Correct.
all those kind of wonderful things. Got it. Thank you, sir.
No problem. Pepper spray we covered. Unless there's any questions, I'll move on.
What's the distance between a suspect and a police officer to have the pepper spray be effective?
So typically outside of, it comes out in a stream. as compared to a mist, because a mist is going to affect a lot more individuals, right? I want it to be much more target-based as compared to just simply spraying a crowd of individuals. I want it to be target-based, so I'm usually looking about a 20-foot threshold. And then once I get too close, we do have something called the hydraulic needle effect, which if you're too close to the target that you're spraying, it can cause
Right.
damage to the eyes. Our canine policy is determined through policy 309. We currently have 7 apprehension dogs at the Santa Ana Police Department, and then we have 1 bloodhound, which is used to locate, not apprehend. A canine may be used to locate and apprehend a suspect if the canine handler reasonably believes that the individual has either committed, is committing, or threatening to commit any serious offense, and if any of the following conditions exist. There is a reasonable belief that the suspect poses an imminent threat of violence or serious harm to the public, any officer, or the handler. The suspect is physically resisting or threatening to resist arrest, and the use of a canine reasonably appears to be necessary to overcome such resistance. The suspect is believed to be concealed in an area where entry by other than the canine would pose a threat to the safety of officers or the public. And there's a requirement for supervisor approval unless you have exigent circumstances, which would then not require supervisory approval. In the past 5 years, we've had 69 applications and 65 of which have been effective.
So is the canine trained to, I guess, how is the canine trained to do, or what is the canine trained to do? To locate or to stop the individual?
Which canine are we referring to? So, because we have 7 apprehension dogs,
Mhm, the
and then we have
apprehension dog,
1.
yeah.
The apprehension dogs, they are utilized to locate individuals. And then if we've met the facts and circumstances laid out, we've met that threshold, they're taught to bite the individual and help with that apprehension process, much like any of the other techniques that we've mentioned to get the individual into custody. Yes, sir.
So where does the apprehension dogs what are they trained to do when they locate the individual? They grab, are they trained to grab the hand? What specific parts of their body are they trained to grab? Like I'm guessing what's kind of what's the assessment? What happens?
Every case is going to be different. Again, much like Mr. Carpenter pointed out, people move during the course of an arrest. Typically, a canine is going to bite at an extremity, which would either be an arm or a leg. Have we had cases where they've bit in other locations? Absolutely. But typically, your canines are going to be more extremity-based apprehensions.
Thank you.
A quick question on that, and I assume they're trained to hold on, correct? They're not trained to just rip you apart, correct?
Correct. So when the
Thank you.
dog bites the individual, they will maintain that bite until removed from the handler or given a verbal, what we call a verbal out, where the handler can call them off. Now, our handlers and our officers are taught the dog stays, in essence, on the bite until the individual is in handcuffs, and it's safe to remove them.
Are your dogs still coming from Germany? What they did back at the beginning and the officers had to learn the German phrases?
So we have some from, I believe most of them are coming from Belgium now, but we do have some from all sorts of locations.
Okay, and the officers are learning the commands in those languages? Okay.
Correct.
Is there a standard for canines that if, let's say, they don't follow commands on 2 occasions, is there something in place where the police department says, okay, this canine just cannot continue to function? And if so, what is that?
So there's a rigorous testing that goes into it. Obviously, if you have specific questions, I can always bring in our canine sergeant that could answer them much better to my knowledge. But I am one of the individuals that does do investigations into our canine apprehensions. Typically what happens is when a dog is selected by our agency, there's a testing process that goes on at our agency until the dog is successfully shown. Much like those, right? Is it going to be willing to actually bite a suspect during an apprehension? Will it verbal out as is required? There's different mechanisms that we test, and our canines must provide a certain amount of training every single month to make sure that they are in line with the standards via post.
What's the typical service time of one of these animals?
Typically, we, on the very early end, will get a dog at maybe 2.5 or 3. Usually it's between 3 and 4. And they, depending on health and durability, you could have a dog that's 10 or 11. But once you kind of get up towards those 10 years, it's, you know, a case by case basis. We'll discuss the baton. It's governed by policy 303, and the baton is utilized when the need to immediately control a suspect, which is weighed against the risk of causing serious injury. The head, neck, throat, spine, heart, kidneys, and groin should not be intentionally targeted except when the officer reasonably believes the suspect poses an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death to the officer or others. In the past 5 years, we've had 44 applications, 28 have been effective. That's a 64% effectiveness rate. There are times, much like is covered in policy 300, which is our overall use of force policy, but within that is a subsection 300.3, which talks about improvised devices. What that does is it allows for circumstances which may arise in which officers reasonably believe that it would be impractical or ineffective to use any of the approved or authorized tools, weapons, or methods provided by the department. Officers may find it more effective or reasonable to improvise their response to rapidly unfolding conditions that they're confronting. In such circumstances, the use of any improvised device or method must nonetheless be objectively reasonable. In the past 5 years, again, it's not a very utilized tool. 11 applications, 9 of which have been effective, and that's an 82% effectiveness rate.
Are the batons department issued?
They are.
Wood, composite?
The
Metal?
ones that are issued through the department are composite.
Okay, and you can't bring your own, the type that expand and that kind of stuff?
We do have the ability to use expandable batons, but they have to be approved usually by the maker of the baton.
But as an officer, I could choose to use that?
Correct.
Okay, so you do have an option as an officer, one you want to pick, correct?
Correct. But number one, it has to be approved. And number two, you have to show competency with that tool.
Understood. And the wood one being longer than the composite and the expendable being longer than all of them?
It
Or
would
is there a
depend.
Is there maximum length, I guess is what I'm asking you.
Our mounted officers who ride on horseback, they have even longer batons than anybody else, typically because they're going to use those from a mounted position. Whereas the wooden batons and the expandable batons, roughly the same dimensions, some depending, there's a little bit of variation.
Thank you.
I'm curious, what's one example of a improvised device?
So if I'm in the course, my partner's in an altercation with an individual and I'm trying to put out radio traffic. So my partner's in an altercation next to me. I'm trying to call for help. And then all of a sudden the individual starts getting the upper hand of my partner. Can I use that radio as an improvised device to strike the individual? Depending on the circumstances, potentially you could. So the end goal, the point of all of the techniques that we've already covered is always to get an individual into handcuffs. Okay, so we have a policy that specific to our handcuffs, and that's policy 302. They are used to restrain a person's hands to ensure officer safety. The policy not only covers the standard issued nickel-plated handcuffs, but it also covers nylon cuffs, plastic cuffs. Oftentimes, like I mentioned to Chair Vega, where we can use multiple cuffs if needed, depending on the size and flexibility of the suspect that we're apprehending. And then we are always going to, I don't want to say always, but the vast majority of the time, handcuff behind the back. We always double lock the cuffs, which is in essence, it's a small button that's depressed. What that does is mitigate the handcuff's ability to tighten because of body weight or pressure that's placed on the cuff. And that's one of the things that our officers are taught. That way, when we place somebody in the back of a car and they push against those handcuffs, it doesn't tighten down, which then mitigates the injury to the wrists. They're removed as soon as reasonable upon confinement in detention facility, or once it's been determined For example, if a description of an individual is provided pursuant to a call for service, I contact that individual, I may place them in handcuffs dependent upon what's found out. If we then do an infield show up where the witness is like, nope, that's not the guy, but that's what he was wearing. Okay. Hey, sorry to trouble you. Thank you for your cooperation. Handcuffs are removed. They're on their way. So it's not always signifying we handcuff somebody, they're going to jail. Sometimes it's just officer safety, detention purposes, pending further investigation, stuff to that nature. The vast majority of the time, I'd say 99% of the time, we place handcuffs on somebody and the fight is typically over. There's no more non-compliance. There's no more combatives. There's no more anything. It's kind of almost like the gig is up and we have no more further use of force. There are times where individuals continue to struggle, fight, kick, or display combatives towards our officers, even after they've been handcuffs. We do have tools for that. The rip hobble, there's a picture of it just to kind of give you a, I guess, understanding of what it looks like. There's a brass end with a locking mechanism that's spring loaded, and then a looped end, which is all nylon. It's not very stretchy. There's not a lot of give to that nylon. It's relatively sturdy. And then we have 4 different techniques that we can utilize for that rip hobble. The first one is the waist handcuff restraint. Typically that's going to be applied around the waist. It's going to be then placed over the portion of the handcuffs that has the links connecting the 2 wrists together, and then back on itself. Typically that's going to be utilized. Let's say we have prior knowledge. We've had prior contact with an individual that's extremely flexible and can slip their handcuffs. So we handcuff them back and all of a sudden we go back to the car and they've put their hands in front. That's a technique that we can utilize that's going to mitigate their ability to do so because it doesn't allow them to get it under their waistline. The leg restraint technique, we have 2 applications for that. One around the ankles. If you place it around the ankles, just understand that's going to extremely mitigate the ability for the individual to walk. You're talking about a couple inches of step, and or you can do it around the knees, which is going to mitigate their ability to walk, but you're still going to get at least a small step pattern from that suspect. That's typically utilized maybe in like a jail transport. We have somebody who's incarcerated at our jail facility. They need some kind of medical clearance as another mechanism of safety. An officer can apply that around the ankles if it's a flight risk or they've been flagged by the jail staff as a flight risk. The arm restraint technique, typically we're going to use this in more of a medical setting. Doctors trying to provide treatment to somebody, get to an IV or something of that nature. They don't want the handcuffs on. So what we'll end up doing is placing the rip hobble, make one big loop. It'll be placed around almost like your bicep area and then hinged across the back. And what that does is mitigate somebody's ability. They kind of look like this when it comes off. That allows the doctor to provide whatever kind of medical treatment they can, but yet there's still a mechanism of control on the individual. And then the final one is the maximum restraint technique. This one is typically utilized in that combative nature. Once the handcuffs have already been applied, somebody's continuing to fight. What it does is there's one placed around the ankles, one placed around the hip there, and then connected at the front, not the back, not by any stretch of the imagination a hog tie. Again, one at the ankles, one at the waist, they're connected at the front, and it mitigates a person's ability to kick. One of the things that we commonly tell our officers, or that they're understanding, when we get into situations where we're applying the maximal restraint, that's not common. Typically, like I mentioned, 99% of the time, handcuffs go on, fight's over. If we're continuing to fight somebody who's already in handcuffs, now we're starting to understand maybe there's something else on board. Maybe we're talking about hyperactive delirium with severe agitation, which is a medical diagnosis, which is going to necessitate medical treatment. That's something that the medics are going to come. If we place somebody in maximum restraint, we always tell our officers, make sure that the medics are the ones taking them to get medically cleared at the hospital. Again, because whether that's because of mental health or some kind of drug-induced psychosis, we're not doctors at the scene. We're going to let the professionals deal with that. We're going to just simply try and control that individual to get them the medical treatment that they need.
Once somebody's in handcuffs, I'm assuming that changes quite a bit some of the use of force that is available, right? Because they could still be spitting. They could use their body to really hurt someone. Let's take a taser as an example. You still tase someone who's handcuffed if they're being very, very combative?
I would never say, never say always. Could I see a time where you could potentially use a taser on a handcuffed individual? Yes, although I would say that the fact pattern would have to be extremely specific and the officer would have to articulate quite a lot to justify the use of a taser on a handcuffed individual.
So none of these use of force is automatically off the table. There's still situations where they could still be used. Everything that we've covered so far.
A good question. I'd say it's going to be case specific. Again, I'm never going to say never. I'm never going to say always. I would say if we have a situation where we're utilizing a canine and a handcuffed suspect, something's gone awry. So I would be interested to see what would be the fact pattern that would potentially be used to justify the supervisor on scene telling the canine handler, "Hey, you're good to go for a deployment of a canine." Again, I don't think so, but I'm not going to say never. So again, has there been shootings involving individuals that maybe a gun was missed and we shot somebody that was in handcuffs? I'm not saying we in Santa Ana. I'm talking about we law enforcement as an umbrella term. Sure, absolutely. Does that require a lot of justification and articulation on the facts of the officer? Absolutely. But it would definitely be a factor that you would have to articulate 100%. So de-escalation. This is one of the things that was codified into law several different times within 835. And then kind of like I mentioned in Government Code 7286, it's also codified into law. De-escalation is simply the process of using strategies and techniques intended to decrease the intensity of a situation. That's the definition. Now, why is it important to law enforcement? Why was it added to 835? Here's what we're talking about. 835 Alpha 2 or A2. It is the intent of the legislature that peace officers use deadly force only when necessary in defense of human life. In determining whether deadly force is necessary, officers shall evaluate each situation in light of the particular circumstances of each case and shall use other available resources and techniques if reasonably safe and feasible to an objectively reasonable officer. Now, while that doesn't say de-escalation, it does say other available resources. I would say de-escalation is one of those terms that would be synonymous with other available resources or other options outside of deadly force, but outside of any force. De-escalation is always what we're looking for. On a different note, 7286, like I said, it's actually specifically noted. It's a requirement that officers utilize de-escalation techniques, crisis intervention tactics, and other alternatives to force when feasible. So it's codified twice there. It's codified one more time, which we'll discuss. But there's a couple misnomers when it comes to de-escalation. I would ask rhetorically, in your opinion, is de-escalation a goal or a strategy? I would surmise that it's a goal. Never once on any of the uses of force have I reviewed has the officer or the supervisor shown up and say, "Hey, Smith, grab the de-escalation tactics," right? Grab the de-escalation bag. No, it's a goal, but it requires a willing participant. So we're going to do everything we can to mitigate a use of force, but at the same time, it requires a willing participant. I can't force somebody to de-escalate. I'm going to do everything I can, provide every opportunity for de-escalation, but it's still a partnership. It's a collaboration. Here's where, again, it's mentioned specifically de-escalation 835 Alpha D. A peace officer who makes or attempts to make an arrest need not retreat or desist from their efforts by reason of the resistance or threatened resistance of the person being arrested. A peace officer shall not be deemed an aggressor or lose the right to self-defense by the use of objectively reasonable force in compliance with subdivisions B and C to effect the arrest or to prevent escape or to overcome resistance. For the purpose of this subdivision, retreat does not mean tactical reposition or other de-escalation tactics. So that's extremely important because there's no definition provided for what is or what is not de-escalation within 835 outside of that last sentence. in essence, what they're saying is tactical reposition is a form of de-escalation. Now, is that a passive mandate? Is that something that's mandatory for law enforcement to do prior to the utilization of any force, is to tactically reposition? I don't know. Again, a lot of these are interpretations. What Mr. Touchstone, the training that he gave you, that's his interpretation of it. We have our interpretation of it. We're still waiting for the clarity of the courts to come down and give us a little bit more specifics as to what is and what is not. So what I kind of mentioned up there, it'd be like everybody's spouse is different. If I were to ask my wife, like, hey, you know what? My bosses were so proud with the presentation I gave. They said, you know what? You can go to Vegas. It's on us. What do you think? Now, my wife is not vague and ambiguous. My wife's going to say absolutely not. Some people have vague and ambiguous spouses where they would say something more along the lines of, well, if that's what you think a good husband or father would do. That's kind of what we're talking about. There's a little bit of vagueness and some ambiguity that we're still waiting for some clarity through the court system. And we're going to need that clarity. But this is one thing where they actually lay out, this is de-escalation in regards to 835, and that's talking about tactical repositioning. Another thing where we have the definition of de-escalation, which is to lessen the intensity of a potentially violent situation. So I ask you this, is it okay for me to momentarily increase the intensity of a situation if the overall goal is to decrease the intensity? You may be asking, well, what am I referring to? If I've gone through hours of negotiations and I end up releasing a canine in an individual, I would highly doubt that that individual doesn't think that I'm intensifying the situation. But if that prevents us in law enforcement from utilizing deadly force and shooting the individual, is there a little bit of leeway? Is there a shade of gray? Is there an area to operate to where sometimes we can intensify the situation if the overall goal is to de-escalate the situation in the long run? I don't know. Again, there's a lot of vagueness in 835 specific when we talk about de-escalation, as well as when we talk about 7286 and that government code. And then the other question is it outcome based? If we have an 8-hour standoff with an individual and they refuse to de-escalate with us and it leads to a use of force or an officer involved shooting, does that mean we failed? I don't know. I would certainly hope not. Like I said, we're still looking for collaboration. It's a partnership. It's a give and take. I'm going to provide, or we as the police department are going to provide every opportunity for somebody to de-escalate with us, but it's a partnership that requires some kind of collaboration, a back and forth, a give and take. Understanding full well, there's certain barriers that we may or may not be able to overcome. We're going to do everything we can to do it. And that's what we're teaching our officers. When we talk about strategies, again, sometimes you're going into a situation and you're already behind the 8 ball. Maybe the individual is anti-police because of their upbringing, because of a situation they've been involved in. Is that not going to be a harder threshold for me to overcome than somebody who's just having a rough day, but maybe happens to have a favorable perception of police? Sure. There's a bunch of strategies that we can use. Time and distance is always going to be our friend. The days of rushing through things are long overdue. They're gone. Time and distance are now our friends. The other available resources, everything we've talked about as far as the options that an officer has, those in essence can be de-escalation based, provided certain facts and circumstances are understood given the totality of what the officers are dealing with. All right. One of the things that we'll constantly talk about is if we have multiple officers on scene, our goal is to have one individual talking with whoever it is that we're trying to de-escalate. Now, the last thing we want that officer who's talking with the individual to do is have their firearm out pointing in their face. The hope is that we have other available resources, other officers who have that lethal coverage, which then frees up our officer who's making that conversation with the individual. Now we can just have a conversation. Now it's just two people talking with the hopes of getting that voluntary compliance, that de-escalation that we're looking for. We have negotiators that can be self-deployed outside of SWAT. When I first got at Santa Ana PD, SWAT and CNT were tied. We would not deploy a negotiator outside of SWAT. Now, with the changes in law, the understanding of how society is looking at police uses of force, we understand negotiators are effective tools that have greater levels of training than your run-of-the-mill regular patrol officer. So that's why we allow for those individuals to be self-deployed outside of a SWAT basis or a SWAT call because of that training that they have. CAT team, right? Mental health professionals. Well, the problem is at 3 a.m, chances are they're not going to be able to respond, but it's at least something that we do have as an option. I'm not going to cover every single one of those. A couple of the more important ones that we're going to talk about is recognizing triggers and hooks. I'm trying to de-escalate the situation. If I get into a touchy subject, again, chances are I don't necessarily have a long history with this individual. So I'm trying to garner through the way that the individual's talking with me, the body language that they're portraying, how they're speaking, in what manner they're speaking. I'm trying to gauge all sorts of indicators as to, am I on the right track? Am I potentially getting closer to compliance? Or did I just go down the wrong avenue and say something I didn't mean to say and triggered the individual, and now all of a sudden I accidentally escalated the situation? Or is it something that the individual, for whatever, whether it's the way I look, the way I talk, maybe that individual just doesn't like me. I have to be able to put my ego aside and say, hey, next officer up, I'll grab lethal cover. You try talking. Is that an option that we can use? Absolutely. Is that another thing that we could potentially utilize to gain that voluntary compliance? Sure. So again, the goal is we're going to have to build that rapport to gain that trust, because again, there's oftentimes various different things that we have to overcome that we may or may not be privy to get that relationship built, that collaboration that we're kind of looking for. One real quick thing on de-escalation. It's not necessarily, we're going to do everything we can to mitigate force utilized, but de-escalation isn't the absence of force. It's the intent to gain voluntary compliance. All right. So again, we're going to need that collaboration, that voluntary compliance in order to be successful at de-escalation, in the sense that no force is utilized. However, there are times when force has to be utilized to lessen the intensity in the long run. When we talk about mental health, it's codified into law 835A5. It talks about individuals with physical, mental health, developmental, or intellectual disabilities are significantly more likely to experience greater levels of physical force during police interactions, as their disability may affect their ability to understand or comply with commands from peace officers. It is estimated that the individuals with disabilities are involved in between 1/3 and 1/2 of all fatal encounters with law enforcement. So when we look at that, one of the things that comes to mind for me is whether it was high school, college, graduate, when you throw in some kind of statistic, you're going to have to put a footnote as to where you got that information from. I don't know where that information came from. Regardless of where it came from, it's of no concern to where it came from to me. It's in there. It's codified into law. It's something we have to be cognizant of and be aware of. Sometimes somebody's mental health disability is very, very apparent and obvious. Other times it's not. And that's going to be something that we have to understand in law enforcement. So one of the tools that we utilized the last time that we did strategic communications as a portion of our advanced officer training was the bag drill. In essence, you see the bag, it's got, when we did it, I ended up cutting out like a square, so it was a little more palatable for the officer, just in case we had anybody that was kind of claustrophobic. I would take that individual outside of the classroom. I'd tell them, hey, I want you to follow every single verbal command that you're given by the officer. Okay. I then take them back inside. I place them at the front of the classroom. I grab a volunteer, sometimes a voluntold individual. I place them at the back of the classroom. I say, hey, there's your suspect. I want you to take him into custody when I tell you to do so. Okay. I then go back to our suspect officer. I hand them a knife and I tell the officer, go ahead and go. And then I start scratching at the ears, where the ears are on that paper bag. I start whispering to the officer. Unless our officer who's playing the role of an officer trying to de-escalate the situation is understanding of exactly what's going on, they may not be successful in this situation. The officers that were successful realized, because I gave them the preface of, hey, you have every available resource here. You've got lethal, you've got less lethal, the helicopter's up, K9's here, SWAT's on standby, SEAL Team 6 is next door. Whatever you need, you have. Just get the individual into a position where you can handcuff them. Officers who began to, once they realized like, hey, they can't hear a thing he's saying, they would act it out. Hey, put it, and all of a sudden we got compliance. Once the drill was over, I'd simply ask our officer, hey, what do you think I told Smith when I took him outside? Oh, you told him to ignore me. Oh, hey, Smith, what'd I tell you? You told me to follow every verbal command. Again, in this situation, if the officer's in tune with what's going on, it's very obvious as to what the disability our student officer is facing. We don't get that luxury when it's a call for service in the field. Sometimes because of premise history or prior calls for service, we may know, but that's kind of a little tool that we utilize to make the officers understand, hey, you're going to have to work at this. Sometimes there's, again, whether it's because of mental health or other unknown factors, there's some barriers you're going to have to overcome. Speed, again, is not recommended. The other thing that we tell them, much like it's not mentioned in here, it's of no concern to us what's caused that mental health crisis, whether that's drug induced or whether that's the individual was born that way. That's of no concern to us. That's not for us to diagnose. We simply deal with the situation at hand. That's kind of the end of our less lethal portion. I'm curious if there's any questions before we move on to our lethal force.
I have one clarifying question.
Yes, ma'am.
All of these actions are with the understanding that you can ascertain whether the person committed the crime, right? Like your goal is just to arrest based on probable cause.
It would depend on the circumstances at hand. If we know for a fact that the individual, maybe it's an arrest warrant for whatever the crime is, well then yeah, the goal is going to be to arrest that individual. If it's a family situation where it's a mental health crisis and we're there in essence as a caveat to assist with some kind of medical assistance, that's a different set of circumstances
I see.
as compared to our jobs to take you to jail tonight.
I see. Thank you.
Chair Vega, you want to move on?
Yes, please.
So now we're talking about deadly force. And we'll talk about it, one, pursuant to 835, and then secondarily, we'll talk about it pursuant to our use of force policy. So something to keep in mind, if you were to read 835 like you read a typical book, top to bottom, left to right, it's going to be very difficult to understand. There's a lot of intermingling, almost like a cobweb is kind of how I would interpret the way it's written. So what I kind of did is I'm going to dance around a little bit as far as the numerics go, but I think it'll serve a purpose in the long run. So we're talking about deadly force. So the first word when we're talking about deadly force is notwithstanding. Not to go back to our English lesson like we did, but notwithstanding is simply a funny or a formal word of saying, forget that stuff I just said. Okay, forget that stuff I just said. Well, what was before this? Our use of force when we're talking about regular force outside of deadly force, objectively reasonable force, right? Reason to cause to believe an individual committed a public offense, overcome resistance, prevent escape, effect an arrest, that aspect of it. That's what we're talking about. Ignore that because now there's a separation or a bifurcation of standards when it comes to use of force. Force, non-deadly or less lethal, the standard is objectively reasonable. Now we're getting into deadly force and we'll kind of cover very quickly what that standard is going to become. So notwithstanding subdivision B, a peace officer is justified in using deadly force upon another person only when the officer reasonably believes, based on the totality of the circumstances, that such force is necessary for either of the following reasons. So before we get into those two reasons, there's probably something I should understand. What is the definition of totality of the circumstances? There's three definitions within 835 that are offered to you. Totality of the circumstances, imminent threat, and deadly force. Those are the three definitions that are provided. Well, there's one of them that they talk about right there, based on the totality of the circumstances. Well, I should probably understand what totality of the circumstances is. It's not codified right underneath that. It's actually not codified until the last line of 835. But the definition of totality of the circumstances mean all facts known to the peace officer at the time, including the conduct of the officer and the subject leading up to the use of deadly force. Now we'll get into the first of the two ways that officers can use deadly force. First one, Charlie 1 Alpha, to defend against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to another person. Now, again, at face value, that's relatively simple to understand, or at least it's simple to read, but we should probably understand what imminent threat is defined as. Well, luckily, it's defined for us. A threat of death or serious bodily injury is imminent when, based on the totality of the circumstances, a reasonable officer in the same situation would believe that a person has the present ability, opportunity, and apparent intent to immediately cause death or serious bodily injury to a peace officer or another person. An imminent harm is not merely a fear of future harm, no matter how great the fear and no matter how great the likelihood of the harm, but is one that, from appearances, must be instantly confronted and addressed. That would be one way in which we can utilize deadly force. There's another way. This one's slightly longer. This is what used to be Tennessee v. Gardner, the fleeing felon type rule. It's still codified into law, but there's a lot more variations in our law. It's a lot more specific than it was in Tennessee versus Gardner. So Charlie 1 Bravo. To apprehend a fleeing person for any felony that threatened or resulted in death or serious bodily injury if the officer reasonably believes that the person will cause death or serious bodily injury to another unless immediately apprehended. Where feasible, a peace officer shall, prior to the use of force, make reasonable efforts to identify themselves as a peace officer and to warn that deadly force may be used unless the officer has objectively reasonable grounds to believe the person is aware of these facts. That was a lot that we just covered in a very brief amount of time. So let me show you, because I believe it's slightly more palatable, more easy to understand how we teach our officers. So this is how we start. We'll start with Charlie 1 Alpha, the first way that we can use deadly force when we talk about imminent threat. All right, so how are we going to start that? You should probably start at an imminent threat. So we have to have an imminent threat, but we have to know what an imminent threat is. So what's an imminent threat? Ability, opportunity, intent. Okay. An imminent threat, which is the ability, opportunity, intent to do what? Cause great bodily injury, or I'm sorry, death or serious bodily injury. Is there any kind of caveat? Yeah. It's not merely a fear of future harm. It has to be instantly confronted. That's slightly more palatable than the first one that we read. And I guarantee you'll agree that this one is going to be more palatable than the second one that we read, which was almost a paragraph long. So Charlie 1 Bravo, commonly referred to as like your fleeing felon rule from Tennessee v. Garner. We have to have a felony that threatened or caused death or serious bodily injury, and the individual is presently fleeing, and the officer believes that they will cause death or serious bodily injury. Is there a caveat? Absolutely, there's a caveat. A warning when feasible. So when you break it down into a more bite-sized portion, it's easier to understand, not only for the officers involved, but for everybody to be able to look at this, again, broken down into a much smaller than what we read in 835. And yet all of the important fact patterns are already covered. Policy 300.4, which is, again, we just covered 835 when we can use deadly force within the confines of the law and a statute within the state of California. Here's 300.4, which is pretty much almost the exact same thing. So the use of deadly force is only justified when the officer reasonably believes it is necessary in the following circumstances. An officer may use deadly force to protect themselves or others from what the officer reasonably believes is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or another person. Relatively the same thing as we just read in 835, Charlie 1 Alpha. Second one, an officer may use deadly force to apprehend a fleeing person for any felony that threatened or resulted in death or serious bodily injury if the officer reasonably believes that the person will cause death or serious bodily injury to another unless immediately apprehended. Again, relatively similar to Charlie 1 Bravo, which was the second portion of 835. Now, I didn't do red marks on every single time that we talked about the word necessary, but like I said, there was a very obvious separation or bifurcation of the standards when it comes to use of force. Less lethal, objectively reasonable, deadly force necessary. So we should probably know what necessary means. Again, easiest way to break it down, something I have to do. I don't really have a whole lot of choices. That's what I have to do because of the facts and circumstances presented to me. It's something that I have to do. What does that look like? Right? Remember, we use the field goal where there's a whole lot of sliding ability. I'll give you a treasure map. If I look anywhere else on that treasure map outside of the X, I'm not going to find anything. Well, the X would represent necessary. That's the bullseye. That's the target I would have to hit in order to use deadly force within the confines of 835 and our use of force policy 300.4, which talks about deadly force. Here's some of the guiding principles specific to Santa Ana Police Department and how we teach this stuff. And the utilization of force and how it's pushed out to our officers of when they apply it, some things to consider. So we talked about it way back in the beginning of the slides, PEP, platform, efficiency, proficiency. So now I'll actually break it down to you. Platform, what's the call for service that I'm responding to? Or what am I doing? Who am I contacting? If I'm getting a call for service, like I kind of mentioned in the first part of an armed robbery that just occurred where the individual was supposed to be armed with a handgun, I'm probably going to get a little more leeway with my force options as compared to a municipal code violation that I'm responding to. Now, could those both turn into deadly force applications? Sure. But again, more leeway is going to be given outright just simply because of what I'm responding to with that first situation of an armed robbery that just occurred where the individual was supposed to be armed. Now, just because I respond to that doesn't mean that's what it is, nor does that mean that simply because I'm responding to that, I can use deadly force. There's a lot of other things that go into it, but that's what platform is. What am I responding to? Efficiency, given whatever the fact pattern is, given the totality of the circumstances as I know them at the time of a use of force or that use of force is imminent, what's the most efficient tool for the job? If you're standing across the Grand Canyon from me, threatening my life, do you have any ability to carry out that threat? Unless you're armed with a high-powered weapon, probably not. At the same time, if you're doing something that could potentially force me to use, I couldn't tell you what it would be as far as what would force me to use a 40 millimeter. Is that even going to reach? Possibly not. So efficiency, what's the most efficient tool for the job? If I have an individual that barricades themselves in a bathroom, fills the bathtub up with water, that's going to mitigate my ability to use a taser. Something to be cognizant of. So what's the most efficient tool for the job? Proficiency is using 20/20 hindsight, being your own worst critic, looking back on that situation. Was that the most efficient tool for the job? Again, you tase somebody in a bathtub full of water, I would recommend that's probably not the most efficient tool for the job in a situation like that. All right. So that's kind of how we break down PEP to our officers. Another way that we do it is CT squared. When a use of force is imminent, meaning it's about to happen. Here's an easy, palatable way for our officers to understand very quickly how to control that individual. Close the distance, take the suspect down, control the suspect, take the suspect into custody. That's it. That's all. Go forth and conquer. When we're talking about force options, we try and mitigate somebody falling into a pattern of repeating the same commands and or utilizing the same force option. If I've hit somebody 7 times, I highly doubt that the 8th time is going to be the effective one. It's time to transition. In essence, if I'm trying to use controlling force, it's not working. Can I punch to maybe cause the hands to come out, which would then allow me to grab hold of the individual's arm and place it behind their back? Absolutely. Would that not be a transitioning type methodology approach to a use of force? Yes, it could be. We tell our officers all the time, ineffective force always appears excessive. I would recommend the next time you're watching a video, what part of that video made that use of force appear excessive? Chances are it's ineffective. I don't really want to use force, so I'm going to kind of half-heartedly maybe punch somebody, but not really. Or my favorite, I'm going to use a distraction strike. We don't teach distraction strikes at Santa Ana. If you're going to punch somebody and you have the platform or the reason to utilize a punch, then utilize a punch and utilize it to the best of your ability to effect that arrest. Ineffective force always appears excessive. The next one is we talk about, and we've kind of brought this all together through various questions. There's a huge importance on report writing because that report has to stand on its own. If you utilize force, that report's got to justify absolutely everything you did and why you did it. Not only that, we've gotten to the point now at Santa Ana where I tell our officers, hey, it may not be good enough to simply say, here's the force option I utilized. Now we may get to the point of, here's the force option I utilized. Here's the other tools I had, but maybe why I didn't use those. Again, maybe because the individual filled the bathtub up with water, therefore mitigating my ability to use the taser. Okay. At the same time, if it's in a bathroom in a house, I'm probably within that 10-foot realm. I can't use the 40 millimeter. Now I'm starting to diminish the number of options that I have. But if that's not in my report, that's either because I'm incompetent or because I'm not good at my job. There's a huge importance on documenting why you did what you did and maybe why you didn't utilize other tools that were available for you. And then we have a big harping process, especially within specific units, but there's a huge onus on debriefing critical incidents, whether that's a use of force, whether that's an officer involved shooting. We're going to debrief these situations because we can learn from absolutely everything. If it was a mistake that we made, okay, well then let's fix that mistake so it doesn't happen again. And if that means that you have to use my body camera to teach somebody else so that they don't have to go down the same path and make the mistake that I made, absolutely. It's a good training tool. It's very easy for me to go to some podunk sheriff department in Oklahoma and pick a video and show our officers and be like, hey, look at this. Look at these guys using force. It hits a lot closer to home when you know who's on that use of force video. That's your partner. And all of a sudden it didn't turn out the way they wanted it to. It hits a lot closer to home. We make enough mistakes. At the same time, we do enough good things. Let's highlight both of those. It can't be all of one or all of the other. So what does it look like? How do we train our officers? How do we go about getting the points that I've kind of driven home to you tonight, or I hope to have driven home to you tonight? Scenario-based training. That's codified into law within the state of California. Scenario-based training. It can't just simply be you sit in front of a simulator and utilize that as your only training tool. It has to be scenario-based. There has to be human interaction. We utilize that all the time. As a way of doing that, that's implemented into our advanced officer training, both in our use of force, our arrest control techniques, and our strategic communication. Those are all, there's varying different scenarios that we utilize during the course of that training to make sure that the point gets hammered home to our officers, the importance of these situations. There's roll call trainings. All of our officers who are in patrol have roll call trainings every single day prior to going in the field. There's other times where myself representing training will come out and give trainings. We'll usually hit the maximum restraint because that is a detailed force option that we have. Let's make sure that we're still functionally able to apply it in a tense, rapidly evolving situation. So we're currently, today we were teaching advanced officer training. We're in the course of one of our cycles. Typically we do it twice a year, once in the fall, once in the spring, and it's a 2-year cycle, kind of like what we talked about the first time we met, where I kind of laid that out to you. So today's cycle was half of the group was at one location doing pursuit training and safe driving. And the other half was at an offsite location utilizing building searching and clearing techniques. Those groups then swapped, and it ended up being a 10 to 12-hour day of training for those officers involved. We also offer to our officers a 1-day controlling force class. Again, I talked about this the first time we met, a 3-day advanced controlling force class. We also have a rigorous in-house jiu-jitsu program that's able for not only our officers to attend, but we even have some professional staff that attend as well. So last year in 2023, we had 351 classes that were taught. So it's on a relatively daily basis, Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. There's a class going on. 6 to 7, usually 6 to 7:15-ish. Tuesday, Friday, Saturday, 4 p.m. And depending on instructor availability, sometimes we have to put that training down. Sometimes we'll add a different day. It just kind of depends. But like I said, 351 classes that we taught in 2023. In the course of we're on our third year of running that program out. We've promoted 16 of our own officers to blue belts. We've promoted 2 officers to purple belts, and we're approaching 25%, slightly over 22% of our officers. And that's total officers that currently train within that program in one facet or another. To my knowledge, there's 3 different models that you have to utilize jiu-jitsu programs within a police department. You have what like the Orange County Sheriff's Department does. They provide tuition reimbursement to officers who attend jiu-jitsu training off-site at whatever gym that they want to attend. They simply have to provide the documentation, provide the showing that they paid for the training, and they get reimbursed on a quarterly basis. That's an option. Another option is like what Pasadena does, where they have a partnership with a particular gym within their city. So the officers' dues, in essence, are paid for by the department, and the officers can go train on the department's dime. The problem, not necessarily a problem, but one of the factors to consider with those first 2 is me as a police department. I don't know what's being taught. I don't know who's teaching it. I may or may not know. I'm going to know who's teaching it, but do I know how they're teaching it, what they're showing, the techniques they're showing? I don't know any of that, nor can I control that. At least with our model, all of our instructors, except for one who happens to be a black belt, are defensive tactics instructors as well. So there's a very close correlation between use of force, defensive tactics, and our jiu-jitsu program. Again, not necessarily saying that's the greatest way, but it's definitely a way, and we're blessed to have it. And I think what you'll see in the table here is some results because of that situation. So in 2023, we had 182,816 contacts by our officers to members of the public. Sometimes that's a call for service. Sometimes that's proactive enforcement. Sometimes that's follow up on a investigation. But that's almost 183,000 contacts. Out of all of those, we had 322 use of force incidents. That's 0.176%, less than 1/5 of 1/2 of our contacts with the public result in a form of use of force. At the same time, we only had 1 officer involved shooting with 0.00055%. So it's not even, that's even lower than our use of force incidents. A factor to keep in mind, when a use of force at our jail happens, that comes over to me. I don't investigate it because they have their own me at the jail facility, but that use of force total goes towards the total of the police department. Why? Because we all fall under the same umbrella. So that use of force total is going to drive our use of force stats up. But at the same time, we don't have a mechanism to quantify the contacts that our jail staff makes on a daily basis. We just can't do it. So in essence, 182,000 contacts is by our police officers in the field, not our jail staff. If we counted our jail staff contacts, if we had a way to quantify that, I would tell you that those statistics are going to be even lower than they already are. If you look at the table at the right, again, this is kind of a year into our jiu-jitsu program. And then now we're talking about 2 years into our jiu-jitsu program. Look at the control holds, vastly up. Our takedowns, vastly up. If you were to ask a collegiate level wrestler if they would sign off on a 96% takedown effectiveness rate, I guarantee you they would. They'd probably be a national champion. That's pretty good numerics. Our punches, down. Our other personal body weapons outside of punches, kicks, knees, elbows, stuff of that nature, down. Our utilization of the taser, down. I think there's a direct correlation between our jiu-jitsu program, our understanding, our overall training program, how we push that out to our officers, and the statistics you see in front of you.
I have a question about that.
Yes, ma'am.
By context, you mean you showing up to the scene, but not necessarily having physical contact with that individual, not everything turn into arrest or to a citation or turn into custody, the 182,000 contacts, correct?
I would have to say, I don't know the mechanism by which that they document what is and what is not a contact. I would venture to bet it has some kind of documentation nexus to police reports, contacts in police reports, contacts in the fields, our ability to take notes on calls for service. I'm not sure exactly how they quantify that. I can try and get that information to you. That's a great question. I wish I had had that information for you.
Yeah, and then I wondered if this is a standard in which police departments calculate the use of force incidents, like the 322 over the 182,000. And obviously that would be a small percentage that you have here, right? Because on research it's calculated slightly different. It's only if you had an actual physical contact, because a call or you just showing up wouldn't lead to an altercation or physical. And so I was just wondering if you had the ability to differentiate so that we can have like accurate numbers of use of force.
Commissioner, if I may, and sorry,
Yes, sir.
Brandon, to interject, I do know. So this report, the number of contacts is essentially the number of times police officers either proactively or were dispatched out to calls, made contact with a resident, whether it's, hey, I got a parking issue here, or hey, my house was burglarized. Anytime an officer was dispatched, anytime an officer came in contact with a member of the public, it got counted towards a police contact. And in contrast, like the sergeant was saying, that number of 0.176 is less than 0.25%. And it's been like that for a while. At Santa Ana, we do take pride in not always, we don't always use force. We don't always have to. And we come in contact with our community a lot. And to the extent that, we try to capture that data, we do. We do capture it, because I think on average, we're 13 to 14,000, police contacts every month. We document it. We post those stats up on our website as well, so that folks can see and feel confident knowing that, yeah, we're not out there being heavy-handed. We're not out there using an abundance of force. In fact, our officers are trained very well and they use, relatively low amounts of force.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. And thank you for clarifying. I think my point was that in research, that's not how they calculate use of force. And I'm happy to send some stuff and we can discuss that later, but thank you.
When you say they use,
So usually if you see a lot of the RIPA reports or some of the studies, even by PPIC, the way in which use of force is only if you actually had a contact, whether you arrested someone or you
okay.
cited. And so it's a physical, right? Because it leads to the potential of use of force rather than just context can obviously underscore when that's used.
I understand now. I missed that point when I was giving you my explanation. I agree. Yeah, that is a different methodology to report, force as it relates to arrests. This here is just the totality of community engagement, because there's always a potential there for some sort of arrest or some sort of, physical confrontation. And so to the extent that we could, model the data that you're talking about, yeah, that could be done. We just decided to make it so that the community saw, by and large, we contact the community a ton, and we're not using a lot of force.
What questions do you have, whether it's about the lethal force that we just covered or even back to our less lethal portion?
Thank you for the presentation. And again, I appreciate you pointing out the distinctions when it comes to necessarily and also, reflected throughout the different policies of the department. I have one question, which is I'm not sure if it's gonna be covered later in the future, but when it comes to incidents where use of force, specifically lethal force is used, let's say an individual, lethal force has been applied, the individual, whether it was a gun or whatever that is, and now we're at the point where clearly the individual is now on the ground, it has been neutralized. What's the time? What's the time that the police department considers the time frame for medical assistance to be provided to that individual?
As soon as safe and feasible to do so. So it would depend on the circumstances And are you referring to when we utilize deadly force in the sense of shooting somebody?
Correct.
So it's going to be as soon as safe and feasible to do so. So for example, if we're in a warehouse where we ended up shooting somebody, but we still have somebody outstanding, we're going to get to that individual as soon as safe and feasible to do so, while at the same time still providing for the safety of the officers and that suspect at the same time. Typically, we're going to probably try and move that individual to a safer location to provide the medical treatment. And we do a much better job nowadays at having our medics on standby and already on scene. So it mitigates that response time that typically is required when we're contacting somebody. So if we're going to be searching a location, chances are medics are already going to be on standby.
Thank you. Yeah, and the reason why I asked the question is, and specifically the incidents that have created a lot of public outrage, nationally, not here, but in other places. It's been the response or the medical response to individuals. We see videos of individuals laying down on the ground, clearly can't move, clearly they were shot, clearly something happened there where the officer, was able to neutralize them. But medical assistance sometimes takes like 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour. And I think those are the incidents where it really has created a public concern. And so that's what I was wondering, what's the policy here at the department when those incidents do occur?
Yeah, it's not going to be a time policy. It has to be done within 35 seconds, 1 minute, whatever the case is. It's going to be more of a based on the safe and feasible practical nature of being able to provide medical aid while at the same time providing for the safety of the officers involved, the suspect involved, and the citizens and residents as a whole.
Has there been an incident, and what are you gonna say?
In addition to that, we do have all of our officers attend our tactical emergency casualty care training, right? So where they receive that specific training to provide that aid, specifically during that gap from whether feasibleness to bring somebody in or while waiting for the medics to arrive. We have a array of examples that we utilize when we teach these courses. These are almost on a monthly basis, but everybody goes to them. So to your question, yes, it is when feasible. However, when we talk about medical aid, it's not just also responding to them. I'm very proud to say this department has not only received the training, but you'll see time after time. And what we do is we train them and encourage them to, one, because of the fact that we have the duty to care for them, but regardless of that individual being, say, a suspect or somebody who initially, wanted to cause harm, it's also an opportunity for those officers to get that experience, get that exposure, because in the event that could be the next time could be on their partner. So rather than not also having, so it's a twofold. So in addition to the primary focus is to provide that medical aid for them and to have it, but also we allow them to, to recognize that this is also an opportunity for you to experience, God forbid, this happens to yourself or to your partner. So just wanted to add to that because that is something that all the officers are mandated to do, and they do receive that training as well.
Thank you. That actually answered my next question.
And that class comes with kits, which provides chest seals, gauze that helps coagulate the blood to mitigate blood loss, and then tourniquets as well.
Do any other commissioners have any final questions?
Very interesting evening. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Sergeant Brandon, thank you for that presentation. I really do appreciate that. One question I had, are we eventually going to talk about policies revolving around driving, officers driving out there?
I believe that's on the expanded course outline.
Okay.
That will be a portion that is covered. Yes, sir.
Okay. No, I have no other questions. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
I was just gonna say thank you, Chair Vega, for that question. I was driving the other night and I go blinded by a flashlight. And I was like, what the heck? I have my window down.
Okay, that concludes the business calendar. We're gonna move on to comments, starting with staff. Staff, do we have any comments?
I have no comments. I don't know. PD just commented quite a bit, so I think that, I think we're all good on that front. You wanna discuss that? Sure, yeah, we could talk a little bit. I am attempting to schedule, I'm attempting to schedule the next training with that entity I had mentioned previously, NACOL. I also have confirmed that the ACLU will provide a very narrowly tailored presentation with regard to AB 392. So those two will be upcoming. In terms of complaints, we have still not received any complaints to the portal. I know that I've had a conversation with Mr. Soto about promoting, if you will, the link to the complaint portal. I believe all of you now should have received the link to the complaint portal. Also, I believe you all should have received, excuse me, a link today which contained all active lawsuits against the police department that allege in any way any of the misconduct that is set forth in the ordinance. I know some statistics have been provided here, hopefully addressing a lot of your concerns. Vice Chair, I know that there was some outstanding statistics you were looking for. Unfortunately, due to the pending litigation I mentioned, and then our actual PD legal advisor believes that there's pending litigation that might affect also the ages as well. The statistics you're looking for are probably not going to be forthcoming at this time, just because of the injunction that was issued in that Northern California case.
That does not apply to the citizenry. I had asked some questions about that also. Also, I understand the other aspect of it. I appreciate it. We had that discussion.
Arrest records. I'm gonna defer, can I defer to you on that one, George? Because you had talked about, remember we talked about the districts and versus the.
Yes,
boards.
it's my understanding you asked for arrest reports specific toward, as of now, our city is divided as far as in our police department by districts and 4 quadrants. So gathering or even collecting that data specific towards.
That's fine then. I wasn't aware that's how you divided it up, but that's fine. If you can do it by district, that's wonderful. It's not that hard to extrapolate what wards those are given an overlay of your districts, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's fine then. If you can provide, that's wonderful. Yeah, I don't need to be that granular about it. Yeah, I just not trying to make more work for you guys. It's just be some nice information to have. And if that's what you have available, that's wonderful. I can figure out what ward that is by an overlay.
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
thank you.
Any further comments from staff? Okay, so we'll move on to Commissioner closing comments. I'll start to my left, Commissioner Said.
Yes, thank you. That was a really good presentation. Thank you.
Commissioner Mejia.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I did have a question, and it's okay if you don't have the answer, you can have it for the next meeting, but I was aware of the incident on social media that you might probably have seen of one of the Santa Ana PD officers obstructing one of the motorcyclists. I don't know if you've seen the video on social media yet. It's a video. I'm happy to share it and send it via email. Essentially, it's showing a Santa Ana PD officer trying to obstruct a motorcycle passing through. And I was just curious as to see if that's what the policy for that is. But if you haven't seen it, I'm happy to share.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I haven't seen the
know.
video,
Yeah,
so,
I can share it. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Commissioner Perea.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. No comments.
Vice Chair.
Yeah, I would like to also recommend that we have the past present look at arrests, as Mr. Pereira had brought up. I think that's a good idea to compare where we were and where we are. Does that make sense?
Can you repeat that again? I'm sorry. I didn't.
Commissioner Pereira had brought up about looking at some past arrests and what we are doing different now. Comparing the past to the present situations, our policies. I think that's a good idea. If we could have, and it doesn't have to be super extensive. I think some kind of major high points of, and again, we're talking use of force. you know, things that were done in the past and what we would do differently now. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think what was discussed was almost taking a few critical incidents and reviewing them and breaking down how things are different now, or how policies are different now, policies and procedures versus then, and where the situation may have gone astray, and maybe a little other scenario based stuff, and kind of having almost like a work study group about those situations.
Exactly. That's exactly
And
it.
we can
Thank you,
put it
sir.
on, we can put it on as a work study.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Commissioner Goronsky.
But also remember that simulator.
Well, thank you, staff, once again for today. Thank you for sending that link. Is it my understanding that right now that link only exists in the Police Oversight Commission webpage?
I do not know the answer to that question. I would have to find out. I would have to confer with Mr. Soto about that.
Okay, because I had received the link and I was trying to look it up, but my first instinct was to go to the Santa Ana Police webpage, but I couldn't find it there. And then when I went back to the link that was sent to us, it was in our commission page, which you have to get to through the clerk's page, and then you have to click on
Sure.
commissioner and it's just too many steps to get to that link. I think the obvious, it's great if we keep it there, that's fine.
Mhm.
But I believe that we should also have it in the Santa Ana PD webpage in the tab where you click file a complaint. I think that link belongs there too.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would obviously defer to the deputy chief here on that because it is related to the PD, but to the extent it's possible, I think it would be helpful to have the link kind of next to the PD complaint link too.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. We can explore that and work to get it up there as soon as possible.
Thank you. And Assistant City Attorney, I asked you earlier, but just so the public knows, they can, when they make a complaint, they can be anonymous if they choose to be, right?
Correct, Chair Vega. The ordinance does set forth that anonymous complaints will be considered and investigated, and that they will be accepted. So they can be anonymous.
Okay, thank you. I have no other questions. So with no further business before the commission, I hereby adjourn the commission meeting. The time is 8:07 p.m. The next meeting of the Police Oversight Commission is scheduled for April 11th, 2024 at 5 p.m.
Yeah, there you go.